Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Again, allow me to welcome you here at the 2018 convention, and I truly hope that you will find this inspiring and that it will really help you also in your networking abilities and meeting with more people, building out on your businesses, and also that we as an industry can discuss together some of the challenges that we are faced. I did introduce me last night, but there were so many different activities as well. So for your benefit, my name is Gerard Maree, and I'm currently the chairman of the Road Trade Association. And I will be hosting you the first part of this morning, and then I will hand over to some of the other board members. Just a number of house rules, just to make it easier for everybody. If we could just ask that all cell phones either be switched off or onto silent, just so that it does not interfere with everybody else that is partaking. Secondly, the bathrooms out onto my right, and then just to your left you'll find that. The emergency exits are marked should there be a problem, and I think Sampi explained that last night quite well, so when you hear a shout, take cover. For those of you that is smoking, again, please not within the buildings. Smoking area is again to my right, just out past the simulator, out onto the balcony. Take an umbrella or something, or hold onto that cigarette so that it doesn't blow away and we've got another fire. But yeah, please enjoy yourself. Our first activity or item that we're going to have is the RFA Conference opening DVD. Now, on that moment of truth, I would like to call upon Shamini Naidu, our CEO, to do the official welcome. Thank you, Shamini.
The Acting Deputy Director General Road Transport, distinguished guests, speakers, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and a special welcome to RFA Convention 2018, Moment of Truth. Sadly, it seems to be a time of astounding transformation and revelations, great political turmoil and economic change. Tensions are high, people are hungry, jobs are scarce, and protests are becoming more violent. Unfortunately, the trucking industry has been roped into what we believe has nothing to do with foreign drivers, but a deeper political agenda. On Easter Monday, over 9 trucks were burnt and 35 trucks were damaged and looted on the N3 near the Moy River toll plaza, allegedly because the trucking industry employs foreign drivers. This brought the N3 to a standstill and highlighted the vulnerability of the trucking industry. Since then, trucks are being torched daily to block routes and attract attention. It seems that the more violent the protest, the more attention it generates, and the more media coverage the protesters generate. To date, over 80 trucks have been burnt, and many have been stoned, and many more are at risk each day. On May 1st, a code red urgent alert went out to the trucking industry to get the trucks off the road on the N3, the N1, the N11, and all other major routes. Intel was received that the trucks were going to be attacked that night. Although the police were on high alert and the attacks were averted, the trucking industry was held at ransom, and it came at a cost, 320 million to operators transporting for gain, and no less than 2 billion rand to the economy. And our woes are far from over. The High Cube container moratorium draws to an end on the 1st of January 2019. After repeated attempts to engage with the Department of Transport, the Minister has indicated that the legislation will not be amended to accommodate the High Cube restriction. Should operators be forced to change their trailers, it will result in an increase in CPI of between 0.7% and 1.3%, and operators could see an increase in 25% in capital costs. Warehousing and time delays will also increase. Shipping companies will move to other ports, and South Africa will lose more revenue. The auto bill is expected to come into effect this year to bring about tougher consequences for traffic offenders. This despite the concerns about constitutional violations, procedural irregularities, lack of public support, and lack of public transport. Already, 180 million has been approved in this year's transport budget for the Road Traffic Infringement Agency to spend on enterprise development for the auto rollout. On the economic front, South Africa continues to fall far behind its global and African peers. Past growth has averaged less than 2%, while similar emerging markets have shown growth rates in excess of 5%. Major contributors have been corruption, state capture, and the decline in both domestic and foreign investment. According to Minister Pravin Gordhan, about 100 billion or more, which is about 9% of government expenditure, could have been lost to state capture. This could have easily paid for social grants, the building of houses, and free higher education. And more importantly, the 1% increase in VAT could have been avoided. As margins are squeezed, businesses are under constant pressure to increase shareholder returns and have been tempted to chase short-term gains and sacrifice governance and ethics. As a result, tighter regulatory controls around governance and accountability will now come into effect. Competition law attempts to protect consumers and prevent anti-competitive behavior and the abuse of economic power. In an attempt to attract and keep business, operators have inadvertently crossed the line, which has resulted in hefty fines and serious reputational damage. The growing prevalence of strikes in key sectors of our economy threatens to stifle economic growth. The wage strike in the platinum sector in 2014 cost employees 4.4 billion in lost wages and employers some 10 billion in lost production. And it has been said that the bus sector will count the cost of the month-long strike for years to come. Wage negotiations in the road freight industry will commence soon, and we hope that we will be able to reach agreement with minimum disruption and cost. While economic transformation may be long overdue, many analysts say that radical economic transformation is mere political rhetoric, as the exact meaning of the term radical economic transformation and how it will impact the broader economy has not yet been clearly defined. At any given time, more freight is moved by road around the country than you can imagine. The trucking industry works tirelessly around the clock to ensure that deliveries are made on time, even amidst the dangers. And while it may look easy, it takes experience to manage the complexities, a thirst for excitement, and a stomach for adventure to make it work. Behind the scenes, it is only due to a flexible network, strides in technology, commitment, dedication, passion, and being able to adapt to the toughest situations in the ever-changing logistic landscape that ensures efficiency and reliability. In our lobbying efforts with government, the trucking industry is met with such resistance and disdain. There is also much animosity by the public, and motorists are always complaining about the trucks on the road. Well, move over, Mr. Motorist, show some respect. We pay more taxes than you, and we may well be delivering your flat-screen TV or your new smartphone that you're rushing out to buy. Ladies and gentlemen, the RFA salutes you for the hard work that you do, and we will continue to lobby and negotiate for you to the best of our ability. Without trucks, South Africa stops. Thank you.
I know it often sounds a bit as a cliche when we say that without trucks, South Africa stops. But we have seen it so many times that when there is a prolonged protest or a prolonged strike, that the shells are actually starting to run dry and that there's a panic because the fuel and the diesel are not delivered on time. So for a moment, I think we must just sometimes reflect that this is not just a saying, it's actually the truth of what we are faced with. As in transport, and we often need to deal with the unexpected and changes either in a route or something, unfortunately, the Deputy Minister of Transport will no longer be able to address us today. There is a ANC National Executive Committee meeting taking place, and from what we could gather, everybody has been instructed to be there. So we unfortunately do not have the Deputy Minister here. However, she has arranged and made the necessary arrangements for somebody to do that can address us, and Mr. Mzo Futswane, the Acting Deputy Director General, Road Transport, will be delivering the opening address on her behalf. Mzo, thank you very much.
Thank you, Program Director, the Chairman of the Association. I greet you, the members of the board, the CEO, Ms. Naidu, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is a pleasure to be invited to speak to this convention of the Road Freight Association. As I stand here, I've been given a prepared speech, and I will not necessarily deviate for it due to protocol on how the government of South Africa operates. It is always a collective, even if you differ, it's not unanimous. We also appreciate the opportunity afforded to reflect with you on the matters affecting Road Freight Association, specifically the region. Our economy is currently facing emerging security threats associated with the touching of trucks on our major roads. These developments have the capacity to undermine the vibrancy of commercial road transport industry in this country as well as in the region. As the government, we have tasked the Cross-Border Transport Agency as the current chair of the Cross-Border and Road Transport Regulation Forum in the SADC region to urgently engage with our counterparts and to formulate concrete measures in dealing with this problem. This must include proposing appropriate measures as a recommendation to the SADC meeting of Ministers of Transport on how we should collectively deal and tackle this challenge. As members of the Road Freight Association, you may not be aware of the recent established SADC Cross-Border Road Transport Regulators Forum, which was launched following the successful International Road Transport Indaba, which was hosted by the Cross-Border Agency in October last year, 2017. The SADC Cross-Border Road Transport Regulators Forum is a platform through which different road transport regulators, transport ministers among the inlet SADC member states, and are able to communicate, share, lobby, and influence one another. Our intention as South African government is to make use of this forum for purposes of ensuring realization, objectives, and harmonization of the regulatory framework. Through this forum, we seek to monitor compliance of all inland member states to chapters of 5 and 6 of the protocol, communication and meteorology. As you will know, the full implementation of these chapters of the SADC protocol will result in tackling some of the greatest challenges in the sector, including the vexing issues of the third-party insurance, discriminatory applications of road user charges by different member states. The protocol calls for mutual recognition and harmonization on all provisions of these chapters. Failing to mutually recognize provisions of this protocol calls for member states to reciprocate. We have also tasked the department to embark on the process to include cross-border road charges as part of the road policy of government that is currently under development. Ladies and gentlemen, as you would be expected, the Road Transport Regulators Forum has been working tirelessly, coordinating efforts on our behalf to get to the bottom of the arson, violence, and challenges currently being experienced by the road freight industry. Through this platform, we have gathered the following information. Truck drivers within SADC have been petitioned. Zambia has written to the Minister of International Relations seeking assurance from the South African government that their trucks and drivers will not be hammered on Southern Road. Zimbabwe has requested to join a bilateral meeting between South Africa and Zambia, as they would like to raise issues pertaining to the safety of their citizens in bona fide driving jobs within the Republic of South Africa. The SADC Secretariat has urged the Cross-Border Regulators Forum to issue a statement in which it is urged to condemn these attacks and make recommendations to government to protect the drivers. As you would expect, the argument is that the Regulators Forum cannot just be interested in regulating in an insecure environment. Whilst awaiting a regional report from the SADC Regulators Forum, the South African government is giving serious consideration and providing effective response to this emerging task. We are very mindful of the fact that these threats have the capacity to severely undermine the efficiency of the international road transport industry, which is the bedrock of South African trade within the region. This then brings us to what we have determined, and the nature of the intelligence of the South African Police Services has shared as this following. It is claimed that South African truck companies are giving preference to employment of foreign truck drivers at the expense of their South African counterparts. 2, it is alleged that the Department of Home Affairs, which is responsible for issuance of work permits to foreigners wishing to work in South Africa, has not been regulating the issuance of such licenses permits. The following are some of the reasons that have been advanced in this regard, allegedly by the trucking industry. Seeking to bypass the payment of crosser board driving allowances, seeking to avoid the payment of night shift allowances, refusal by the South African drivers to operate unroadworthy trucks, the assumed language of foreign drivers in comparison to their South African counterparts. The other issue apparently raised by yourselves as representatives of the industry in this regard to the employment of local truck drivers include the following allegations: that locals do not want to do cross-border operations. 2, that they are not sufficiently skilled as drivers. 3, that they don't know the foreign languages. 4, they abandon trucks in protest for long wages or long hours. 5, the drivers demand full day payment rate even when they work less hours based on the contract. Ladies and gentlemen, it is necessary to show commitment to well-being of South Africans by committing to a session of open, honest, robust, continuous engagement and discussions that must be held between South African freight companies, representatives of truck drivers, officials of the Department of Transport and its agency, to find a lasting solution to the concerns raised by the truck drivers. Program Director, the Department of Transport is aware of the many challenges industry that is paying the trade across the border. These are concerns that amount a lot of time of South African government to respond to these issues. Some of the matters being raised by your members include issues of delays at the Zimbabwe side of the border, including the matter of clearing agents. In this regard, there is therefore a need for the association and the government to look at possibilities of having a meeting with the clearing agents and transporters with a view of sensitizing the impact they are making in the process of clearing goods and the delays at the border. We as the Department of Transport working on the implementing a number of interventions aimed to improve the unimpeded flow of road traffic freight and passenger in the region. We have committed to open up the markets for freight road transport, reduced operational constraints of the cross-border as a whole, and to empower operators to maximize business opportunities. The Regulators Forum of SADC will also be instrumental in driving the Linking Africa Plan, which seeks to provide strategic intervention aimed at addressing the so-called soft issues which affect cross-border transport operations. It also seeks to effect the task of harmonizing cross-border trade and governance matters. It is concerned with partnering, working with private sector players to address the light creation of predictable cross-border road operation, cargo owners, traders, forwarders, insurances, and other players that may be in the part of the cross-border trade value chain. As South Africa, together with other countries, COMESA, SADC, tripartite, EAC, we have approved the implementation of tripartite transport and transit facilitation program. In abbreviation, it's a TTTFP. The program was officially launched in Dar es Salaam in October 2017. The main objective of the TTTFP is to develop and implement harmonized transport policies, laws, regulations, and standards, which culminate in efficient cross-border transit networks, logistic services, systems, and procedures. Within this forum, there is one key deliverable to take note that it is a multilateral cross-border transport agreement. This will go a long way towards enabling member states to fully harmonize the road transport policy, regulatory framework, processes, procedures, standards, and practices in the region, all with a view to ensure that cross-border operations are conducted in a conducive environment for all operators. This will lead to the reduction in the cost of compliance, delays, transit times, bribery and corruption, and all overall cost of doing business, especially in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, as you have realized, we have been systematically working through the list of issues raised by your members. As you may recall, the purpose of Road Cross-Border Operations Forum was to afford operators the opportunity to engage with me and the leadership of Cross-Border Association or agency on matters impacting in the operations in the region. Subsequent to this engagement, I instructed the cross-border road agents to set up a dedicated group of people assigned to work to report on matters that surface through the open and genuine engagement we are having. This approach has ensured that we are able to register, report tangible progress on these matters. The Freight Operators Forum is also a platform that the industry must use to register and engage with the counterparts in South African borders. Attendance at this last forum on the 18th of May 2018 was encouraging. We're beginning to see the industry is taking this forum seriously. The next meeting of this forum is scheduled for August 2018. All stakeholders remain invited. Also of concern is the slow transformation, including gender equity or lack thereof within the freight industry, as it still does not reflect the demographics of South Africa. These are some of the matters on which honest and sincere discussion need to take place for the mutual benefit of all stakeholders and interested parties on how we assist each other to transform the industry sustainably. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to urge you as the industry that you work closely with the government, improve the way we see each other in the quest to make South Africa a better country for all, With us, we call upon the association to provide much needed leadership in the sector to keep partners. You remain a voluntary association. That should not impede transformation within the industry. We remain available to you. In fact, it's only a telephone call away. We do request to get feedback from this convention, all the issues discussed that need continuous engagement and in making difference in our job. I wish to have you a fruitful convention or conference, fruitful discussions, and a clear way forward. We now officially open the conference. I thank you.
Mr. Vutsana, thank you very much for standing in on such a short notice. And then just to at least say thank you, just a small gift for appreciation.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you would understand because Mr. Vutsana was on a very short notice asked to stand in. There was a request that there's no question and answer scheduled to deal with that. However, just maybe one or two comments in terms of that. I think it's very important that we realize that the Road Trade Association and then the Transport for Gain is only a portion of all the trucks that is on the road. And quite often you find a number of other operators that is not under this umbrella, that does not fall under the National Bargaining Council, that does not follow and abide by the Bargaining Council, where you could find a number of things happening. I trust that all the members of the Road Trade Association do follow all of that, because that is why we have a code of conduct which all of you sign and abide by, and I'm quite sure that the operating processes and human resource processes that is followed in the companies are that in compliance of the laws of South Africa and towards the betterment of this country in its totality. In terms of ability and wanting to work with government, we assure that we desperately want to engage more, that we have a number of telephone calls that we make on a regular basis to have that engagement. And as every year we hear that the government is open to engage with us, the practice is that sometimes that is a bit slow in the process of happening. So just as much as there's a request for the Road Trade Association to be involved, and we are committed to that, the same question goes to government to make sure, please also then listen to the inputs of one of the stakeholders into this broader process to make sure that we can build a better South Africa for everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, next up is a panel discussion on one of the major issues that we are faced, and that is the impact of the withdrawal of the moratorium on the high cube containers. For the last 7 years, there was a moratorium on high cube containers, and that comes to an end on 31 December 2018. So on the 1st of January 2019, as it stands now, you will not be able to transport a high cube container without you meeting the height restrictions. The Department of Transport does not want to change legislation to accommodate the high cube container operators, and operators will have to comply with the height restriction. Should this moratorium be withdrawn, it will not be a problem just to the container operators. Not much cargo will be distributed from the ports to the reef and other areas if trucks are prevented from moving containers with a height exceeding 4.3 meters. And that is because the majority of containers, which is a worldwide trend, is moving towards high cube containers. And very shortly, you will find very, very little non-high cube containers. We may also find that operators registering cross-border companies and shipping lines going to neighboring countries, which will cost South Africa millions of rand in lost revenue. Now, Gavin Kelly, the Technical Operations Manager in the Road Freight Association, will chair a panel discussion on this, and I ask Gavin and his panelists to please come to the fore, and Gavin will also then be introducing his panel. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Right, as you've heard, my name is Gavin Kelly, the Technical Operations Manager at the Road Freight Association. And that's all you need to know about me, really. Let's just quickly go with the panelists. And I'm going to start right at the very end. It's always easy to start at one end and come this way. Right at the end is Otto van Griethuizen. He's been involved in transport and logistics for many years. That's why he's got white hair. It's got nothing to do with his daughters or his wife. Otto assists us in doing the VCS, the vehicle cost schedules for the RFA, as well as doing engineering drawings and specs. So that's why Otto is here. I was called you Otto, sir.
Otto,
that's why Otto is here. Next to him is Mike Schussler. I'm sure there's no further introduction needed for Mike. He's an economist, and he's going to talk around some of the figures and facts in terms of what options are available. Then next to him we have Kevin Martin. If none of you have ever interacted with Kevin Martin, you have not lived. Kevin Martin is one of the guys I know who's able to talk a cell phone battery flat. Kevin's been involved in ports and container movements for many, many years. I think when the first sailing ships came in, all the way up to today. So he's got a lot of experience and has been involved with the High Cube saga from almost the very, very beginning, before I even came onto the scene. And then next to me is Mike Valvane, who's involved in supply chain management, deals with high cube containers, maybe not physically himself, but also knows all the ins and outs, and has been involved in various positions involved in logistics and containers. Right, thank you very much, gentlemen, for coming along and having a chat. I'm going to do just a brief sketch on high cube containers, because I'm sure you don't want to be bored with stats, but let's have a look at when ISO containers came in. And that's an important point, is that these boxes, as we colloquially call them, are called ISO containers. International Standards Organization containers. The box comes from out there. It wasn't developed in Roslyn or down somewhere south of Durban. This is what's being used around the world, and the dimensions and the sizes and the shape of this box and its weight and how it develops is done in the world as the world logistics majors around the world find new ways of transporting goods. So in 1977, the first of these container boxes appeared on the market. And I'm sure some of you who are just slightly the other side of 21 will remember that South Africa took that by storm, and we developed a number of our ports to specifically deal with these. You'll remember the ports down at Port Elizabeth in Cape Town, where brand new quays were built to deal with containers. And in the heyday, you had these boxes running around. In actual fact, South Africa cut a standard container up into a little thing we used to call a bixie that you used to see running around when guys couldn't afford the full price of a full container. So 1977, ladies and gents, these boxes appeared. And at that stage, they were being transported on vehicles with a deck height equal to or a little bit less of 1.6 meters. The maximum height for vehicles in 1980 was 4.1 meters, and then after a number of rounds of consultations and lobbying, the height was changed in 1991 to 4.3. What's important to know is that all the loading facilities were designed for the semi-trailers that are running around today moving these boxes. And of course, we're now sitting at a stage where the box, the GP box, as some of you will know, GP means general purpose, the 12-meter box has over the last couple of years, last decade, been slowly replaced and actually increased in speed and being replaced by this thing called a high cube container. And what is that? That's a box that's 300 millimeters, a ruler length taller than what the standard GP box is. We've had roughly, in the last 10 years, over 4 million movements of high cube containers. Through the Durban port last year, 888,000 containers were handled, and approximately 75% of those were high cube containers. It's not us who decides who uses the box. That's what comes in and out and through the country. And I think that's where we should stop in terms of the history. Otherwise, I'll see you all switch off. And I'm not going to go into whether Napoleon Bonaparte used them or not. But let's start right at the end over there. Otto, there are a number of reasons that are raised over the years why we cannot transport high-cube containers on the back of a flat deck truck as we do in South Africa. One of these is that they are unstable and they will roll over. Your comment on that, sir?
Well, I've done a couple of stability calculations on both the standard one and the high cube, but there's no problem whatsoever with high cube containers. Even if you put the center of gravity in the top third of the container, there's still no stability problem.
Okay, so there's no stability problem in
whatsoever.
terms of putting that box on there.
Yeah.
Mike, the cost, the revenue that is brought in by this industry, what is that revenue?
I don't know for South Africa. I just want to add to what you started on. In my research, I came across the fact that worldwide there are now 20 to 21 million containers in the world in total. Most of them are 40-foot containers. They're no longer the 20-foot containers. And the 40-foot containers, I had a chat to Kevin, really today 80-90% plus of them being made are high cube containers. This is an investment, according to Drury's, of about $8 billion a year. So roughly in South African rand terms, it's 100 billion a year. We're not going to change that as a small country in South Africa, because while these containers make about 240 million trips a year, we only see about 4 or 5 million of those containers every year in the whole Southern Africa. I mean, Mozambique, Walvis Bay, Durban, the whole Katoot. So ultimately, we're about 2.3% of the world's container market. For containers to be changed for this little part here is not going to happen. So that is quite clear. And then just as a background, this containerization and intermodal transport of containers was started as a standard by many, many organizations over the years. And there were like grocery associations and the like. And that's how the containers became international standard organizations as such. And the high cube was just an added to it because the standard pallet, there is no standard pallet, let's put it this way, but they're typically between 1.2 and 1.6 meters high, the pallets, when they stack them for the groceries. And 80% of groceries are shipped in containers today. And they can then fit on top of each other inside the high cube container. That's what it's worked out to be. And that's why that standard has arisen, because you needed that extra 30 centimeters to make that happen. Now, obviously, you can't put two 1.6s in, but you could put, for example, a 1.3 and a 1.6 in. Okay, I think it's a tight squeeze. But in the majority of cases, I think somewhere around 1.3 to 1.5 is probably the majority of pallets are in that range. And that's probably why that standard was settled on. So I think we've got to understand that this is a worldwide phenomenon. We are a very small part of that worldwide phenomenon. And if we want to change it, it's going to be very costly for our economy, both in terms of imports and exports, inflation, whatever you want, because we are not going to change the world. I think we've got to understand that.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Kevin, what would the implications be of banning high cubes on the current fleet?
Well, I think, is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah, well, I think the simple answer to that, Gavin, is I hope that we got somebody left to switch the lights off before Eskom does the last man out of South Africa, because we just will not be able to operate. It's just not feasible whatsoever. You know, what people have to realize, we in this country talk of a 12-meter, 6-meter. Internationally, we talk of 40-foot and 20-foot. And we move a box. We don't get paid any extra. And there is this thing is that when you move break bulk and you're charging X amount per ton to transport it from Durban to Joburg, be 300 Rand a ton. That if we can get an extra 2 tons in, we can charge an extra 300 Rand a ton. That doesn't apply on containers. We get paid a price to move a container, And the person who saves by using a volumetric container is the client, not the transporter. So number one, transporter gets paid no extra whether it's a GP or high cube. It's not the same as when you're moving break bulk. So that's a very important distinction. The other distinction you have to realize is that with your two types of containers, your 20-foot is a volumetric, is a mass container. It's a 30-ton plate-rated container. The tear weight of the container is approximately 2 tons, which means you're putting 28 tons of cargo inside that container. When you get to a 40-foot, it's a volumetric container from 33 cubes to close to the 70 cubes. So it's double the size, well, just more than double the size of the 20-foot. But that weighs nearly 4 tons. So you only put in 26 tons of cargo in. So that's an important distinction. You're actually moving 2 tons less cargo in terms of tonnage between a 40-foot and a 20-foot. But one is volumetric, one is mass. In other words, your heavy chrome sands, ingots, all your heavy loads go into the 20-foots, all your volumetric loads go into your 40-foots. And really is that if we cannot use the high cube, then what are we going to use? Well, I'll tell you what, our cargo will move to our northern neighbors and we will just close up shop. Because, as you quite rightly said, if we constitute 3% of the world market, they are not going to build the 40-foot GP specifically for the South African market. People must realize that the world containers are in a world pool. They're not special to any particular country. They switch between all nations, and it's not going to happen. So if we get to the 1st of January, then I'm afraid we're going to have to do the same as we did 7 years ago. 7 years ago, we had an unofficial moratorium, which we had had for 8 or 10 years before. And we suddenly got served with notice on the 30th of November that we had to comply with the 4.3 travel height. I was chairman of Harbour Carriers. I made it very simple when I phoned Transnet and said, your port's going to get congested, you're going to get constipated. They weren't interested. When I phoned the shipping lines and said, your boxes are going to just sit in the port, they weren't interested. Everybody became very interested when I turned around and said, we don't accept the appointment. We cannot move these containers legally. We refuse the appointment because I'm under no obligation to move a container. I can accept the work or not. When we did that, within 2 weeks, it became everybody's problem. And within 2 weeks, we managed to sit down around the table and get the present moratorium, which is in place. One thing that happened that Department of Transport did not do, I sat in that meeting and I said, we've done surveys, we've done studies, we've appointed consultants, we've shown you all this. And they insinuated that because we gave instructions to the consultant, we gave our instructions in a predetermined manner to get a predetermined result. When in actual fact, I was right in at the start of this in 2004, 2005, where I brought this up to the KZN task group. And I said, we're buying an abnormal permit. For what? It's a piece of paper, it's just costing money. It's not achieving anything. Why don't we change the law?
I think, okay, Kevin, let's give Mike a chance here. He's been quiet and he's got a lot to say. He's been saying, Mike, your view.
Yeah, I will not try and bore you with too much. First of all, why I'm in this. I'm a forwarder. As such, I'm also involved as a board member of the South African Association of Freight Forwarders, also the Cape Town Port Liaison Forum and all of that. But why I tell you that is that I'm not a vehicle operator. But our business doesn't work without you. So if you're not carrying the containers, we don't have any business either. I've been involved in this just as Kevin has for the last 10 years, since November really of 2010, wasn't it? Yes, yeah. And in that time, there's been one big basic disconnect, because our understanding of the moratorium was that it was granted so that the Department of Transport would have an opportunity to assess the position properly. Their understanding of that was the moratorium was granted so that you would have time to go out and buy all the new equipment. And by the way, the other thing that not many people mention is the dock levelers and loading bays, because there are a lot of those that would have to change as well. Now, how long is that piece of string? My estimation, and it's a rough estimate, is that somewhere between 5 and 8 billion rand is what it would cost to achieve all of that, firstly. And secondly, the time that it would take, which would be a lot longer than we've got between now and the 31st of December. Added to that is the fact that around the world, and if you look at all the countries north of us, they've accepted this, and they have allowed containers up to 2.6 meters, 4.6 meters loads, up to 4.6. So we are the odd man out. Yes, it's true that in other countries, other jurisdictions like the United States, they have lower criteria. And that's fine up to a point, but in our case, for example, we don't really have a rail system that's efficient enough to take all this on. And even if we did, the last and first mile will always be by road. So every single 40-foot high cube container in this country is moved by road at some point. And if all of that was magically stopped on the 31st of December, midnight, all of those would no longer move. One of the industries that I'm particularly involved with is the fruit industry, whose cargo is almost exclusively carried in 40-foot high cube containers. Two reasons. The first, as you've heard, and let me put it another way, is that a high cube holds 24 more cubic meters than a standard GP. And the industry has evolved, so no longer, Mike, is it two pallets of two different heights. There are now purpose-built pallets for high cube containers. The fruit industry exclusively uses those. So if you were to stop them at that point, which, by the way, is the height of the deciduous and grape season, there would be an immediate disaster. There are, I'm not sure of the exact number, but there are about 150,000 fruit containers moving through the port of Cape Town every year. And they're all 40-foot high cube. So you can see the problem. So where are we going with it? As you've heard, the Department of Transport is being rigid. They wrote to the MEC for Economic Affairs in the Western Cape about 2 or 3 weeks ago, in which they clearly said this thing is going to be enforced. We also have an initiative running with the Department of Trade and Industry, who must or should be concerned with this, and everywhere else we can find out. But right as we stand now, the plan is it will be enforced and there will be chaos.
Thank you, Mike. Otto, we get told, just adapt your trailers. Just, cut a little bit of steel out of them.
I would like to see somebody do that.
Well, we got some guys here with grinders and some blow torches.
If you got the cutting, you can fix anything with a cutting torch of, what do you call it, a cutting torch, a crowbar and a front end loader, all right? But this is not going to work, all right?
Why not?
First of all, you can put low profile fifth wheels on. That will lower the height of the front end of the trailer by about 80 millimeters, which is not by far enough. Okay? Then you have to put on new tires on the back with rims and whatever. It's going to cost you another 60 odd grand to replace those 12 tires. But you still won't get to 4.3. It can't be done, not with our standard truck tractors in South Africa. If you want to go to a step deck trailer, you could maybe fit 12 meters onto a step deck in a 10-meter wheelbase. But you won't get payload because all the payload will be sitting on the back end of the trailer, of the axles. If you want to increase the wheelbase to 12.5 meters, the legal wheelbase in South Africa, then let's do it. Then we can do it, okay? But still, the cost of the trailer, what are we going to do with all these flat deck trailers standing around in the whole, I mean, where are we going to go with them? Just put them in the sea and make a, what do you call it, a place where we grow, what do you mean, perlemoen of it.
Yeah. Okay, Otto, so you've quoted a couple of figures. Mike, you've been doing the figures on that. We know who's involved in this sort of industry of moving these containers. What sort of economic impact is that going to have?
Well, it's huge because, I didn't get all the quotes from all the changes that you'd have to do for a step deck, which Otto anyway says is not like really viable. And that's probably why the manufacturers aren't sending quotes, because they're a bit scared of this thing. But if you do, and you say, right, it's going to be specifically built for South Africa, then it's going to cost you more than a flat deck. And you're going to have to invest into this. So a flat deck costs you, say, 300,000, 350, 400,000. You've got to add at least 100, 150,000 to this. On top of that, because the guy on the flat deck can move not just containers, but other stuff as well, it means that if you assume that the guy's doing 70% containers, then he has to recoup that more expensive investment with only 70% of the times that he's going to use it. So it's going to cause a huge problem because, this is an industry which has a 4% profit margin, and these are publicly available figures available from Stats SA for 2010 and 2013. This year, the 2016 figures will come out, and I don't think it's going to change dramatically. It might even be a bit lower, but we'll see what happens. So you're going to force a lot of people to make investments where the returns aren't really there. So that's not good for the industry. The other thing is it's going to increase, obviously, the cost of transport to the reef and to anywhere. Quite frankly, I mean, our rail system does not go into the rural areas anymore. I was at Nampo now for a few years in a row, and one of the big complaints of all the people of all the farmers, but also the people in those regions, is that they can't transport anything by rail at the moment. So I think we've got to be very realistic and say we've got a huge problem, because this is not going to be very, very easily to be overcome, and it will add to the inflation rate. I think it's going to be somewhere between 0.7 and 1.3%, depending on that capital and the usage. And we must remember transport in South Africa, road transport makes up about 7% of the cost basket, if you wish. And I'm leaving out petrol that the consumers pay. I'm saying of the cost basket because that's what our economy has, road transport and so on. But it's also more than that, and I'll finish this, but all our warehouses and stuff are built on the current flat decks. All our distribution centers, all that type of stuff. And the way I understand it from Otterdam, this is going to be a very big different turn if you have to change to the step deck, because you're going to then add not only inconvenience and so on, you add time. So there's a time delay in this thing. And if you think of a product, let's take milk or bread, and I'm not saying they get transported that much on containers, but I'm just using it as an example, is you've got a certain amount in the shops that product is there. If you remove a day from that, it allows for far less of that to be sold. And consumers look at the sell-by date, and the closer the sell-by date gets, the less they want to buy it. And this is going to be a problem for a lot of products. So I think it's going to have a rather big problem for our consumers. It's going to be a rather big problem on the inflation side, and it's going to be a huge problem for South Africa. And it's like taking a little country and saying, I'm going a route that nobody else is going. I don't think you're going to get many people to follow you. In fact, your friends will probably tell you not to, and your enemies will encourage you to do this because they don't mind you making the mistake. So I don't think it's a very good idea at all on the cost side. It's difficult to give an actual hard number at the moment because it's not easy research to do. But ultimately, I really think it will add to our cost base in the economy, make us less competitive, increase the prices for consumers, and particularly if you think of the volume stuff that consumers buy, Rice Krispies or whatever, that's where the problem is going to come into those sort of food baskets.
Thanks, Mike. So we've had Otto talking about changing some of the options, what can be done. We've had Mike talking about how much it's going to cost. Kevin, so there's this urban legend running around that high cube containers roll over, and we had Sanrail talking to us a week ago saying one had just again fallen over. You're involved with that. You move these boxes. How often do they fall over?
Well, put it this way, is our consultant has checked with the shipping lines, and the shipping lines have no... Look, they do roll over, like any container, any vehicle, due to speeding and things, mistakes on the driver's side. But hitting of bridges and rolling over because they're high cube, absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. And talking to the shipping lines, they own the containers. They're saying, checking their records, they're not seeing any increase or any abnormality taking place since we've been running high cubes. Don't forget, we've been running high cubes not for 7 years. We've been running high cubes for nearly 2 decades, nearly 20 years, right? Surely if there was even a chance that one person could die because we were running a high cube, there's no professional would want to run that piece of equipment on the road. Absolutely, right? So it's an absolute, as you say, it's a rumor, it's a legend. There is no factual base for it. Because if there was a factual base, we would all know about it. So it's a mythical figure that is used by people that are called the last resorts of a scoundrel. They come up with nonsense, which is twak, which is a very polite way of putting it.
Would you like to add something, Mike?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, one of the pieces of twat that you were talking about is an argument that came out of the Department of Transport to the effect that as roads are resurfaced, so the containers will get closer to the bridge. Now, all you ever have to do is go and watch them resurfacing a road and digging out the bits they're going to replace to realize that that is a nonsense argument. So that one actually makes no sense whatsoever. In terms of stability, we've tried, certainly not in any scientific way, but to keep an eye on that for the last 7 years. I'm confident in saying there's been no increase in the number of containers that fall off the road. And I'm inclined to believe that as many GP as High Cube do that as well, because as Kevin says, it's for different reasons. In fact, on late last week, late last week, there was a picture doing the rounds of a container that tipped itself off the road at the junction of the R300 and the N1. And I was very pleased to see that it was a GP container. And it went off for other reasons. It was hit from behind by another vehicle. So the two big worries that the department had are actually not relevant. They don't matter. Yeah. And the other last thing about that is that the department sticks to its guns and says, this is what we want to do. Now, those of you who were around may remember what happened in November, December of 2010, when I think it was given roughly 200 vehicles were pulled off the road and fined in Cape Town, in Durban, and a smaller number here in Cape Town. And that 200, which is a very small number, created absolute chaos. Now, I invite the department to extrapolate that and think what the chaos will be like if they do this thing on a grand scale.
Thank you very much. I'm going to allow some final statements, but before we get there, is there anybody in the audience who'd like to ask a question? And I'd like that we haven't, perhaps, I see two hands. If you're not sure, you can find a friend. We've got Don at the back there, there's hand 1, and we've got Liesel in front here, hand 2, and there's Sampi over there, hand 3, and Gerard, hand 4. So if we can go in that order, please. Don at the back first.
Thank you, Gavin. With all respect, gentlemen there's some ladies in the room here. Now, they don't really, not some of them do, but some don't know about step decks and maximum heights. And the question is very simple. For the last 10 years, we've been using the same high trailers to transport high cube containers. So we can go up to a maximum of 4.6 meters on the road. If you look at a passenger coach, it can go up to 4.57 meters. And that carries blood and...
4.65, sorry, Dan.
Ja, 4.65.
4.65. Well, sorry, nog beter. Thank you very much. You can see Otto was involved in that one as well. I've got all the information. What I'm saying to you is when we carry people, flesh and blood, we can go up to 4.65. When we carry a container that's been sent to us from overseas, which is an ISO container, we can only sit at 4.3 meters. Guys, somebody must wake up the Department of Transport. Like we've woken them up, Shamini, when the Road Freight Association has achieved all these unachievable things. We cannot let politicians, and by the way, it was Miss Peters the other day at Legends, and this guy here is today busy, the new Minister of Transport. They don't attend these functions, unfortunately. So they don't hear what's going on. So we as an association need to tell them, and we must use the legal power that we've got to say, if you dare write one ticket to a high cube container on the 1st of January, if you dare, we must warn them and tell them, the Department of Transport, that they are not thinking. I mean, we're sitting here, we can debate this until the cows come home, But some people do not understand. And our association's responsibility to make sure that we go to the powers, like we've changed everything in the world I mean, there's not even a breach formula today anymore. Can you imagine? And how was that possible? We stuck to our guns, and because we are passionate about the industry, we've been telling the lawmakers and the regulationists what we want and how it can work. And that's all we need to do. We need to stand up and explain to them that there's for 10 years nothing has got stuck under a breach. Why? What has happened now? Why will it get stuck now? And we don't have the money to change the trailers. Please, man. Thank you.
Kevin.
Thanks, Don.
Kevin, can I just make a comment on what he said?
I think let's take the round of questions, and then we'll do some answers. So let's just let everybody have a point. Okay, Liesel. Just wait for the mic. Just wait for the mic.
My question, I'm not quite sure if it is even an issue, but as I understand it, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, they've all reverted back to the 4.3. So
4.6.
what does this mean for that cargo destined for those countries? So they'll be illegal in South Africa with their trailers that are at 4.3, but legal in their own countries. Are they going to use other ports? Is anyone kind of thinking about the impact of that? Or is there even an impact?
Okay, we'll get to answer your question on that, so keep that in mind, Kevin. Then we had Sampi over there.
Kevin? Hello.
Yes, who's it?
Oh, okay. Gavin, I just want to take you back, and I want to add on what Don has been saying, that a few years ago, I'm in the abnormal industry. This whole high cube thing started at the ALTC due to the height of 4.3 that's been higher than that. And the question was all about permits that must be issued to these people. That's where the whole thing started. Because the guys do not want to change the height. They've got a special arrangement for the car carriers and for the buses. Now, if it's all about the permits, I don't understand it, because if you do go to a step deck, your wheelbase is going to change, and that's also going to make the vehicle abnormal. So the vehicle will be abnormal. You will have to have a permit to do the transportation anyway. So if they've got an issue with a permit that they need to issue for 4.3 or higher than 4.3, I don't understand where they're coming from. Because the only way you will have to do is to go to a step deck to get the height lower. But to change the wheels or the truck tractor, you will not achieve the right height. So I think we must need to go back to where the real cause is of this thing. Because they just haragat. They don't want to change or give the allowance as they do with the buses and with the car carrier. Because at the same time, the car carriers were then requested to put abnormal boards on their vehicles and have flags because they are higher than 4.3 and they are classified then as abnormal. I think that's where there is a big mistake.
No, that's not.
Right, thank you, Sampi. Just to translate, for those of you who don't speak Afrikaans, haragat in English is they're slightly difficult. And then we go to Gerard.
Slightly difficult. Like that.
Thank you. I've got three questions. The first one actually is exactly the same as what Liesel has already asked. Now, in line with that, I just want to know, what has the European countries done in terms of their heights and their shipping? Because my understanding is that they've in fact changed the legislation to deal with that, but I would like to know what your information is on that. And then the other thing that is important is the past 7 years is not that nothing was done. If I'm not mistaken, there has been a huge number of correspondence, a huge number of approaches to government to say, listen, we want to discuss this, we want to know what you're going to do. It's not something that has happened in the last month to say, oops, 7 years is gone, we don't want to pay for the trailers. This is something that has been tried to be discussed. And I'd like to have your comments upon that effort that was not just done because the transporters don't want to do anything. In fact, the transporters wanted to do something. If I can have some comments on that. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, I think what we'll start with, Otto, do you want to make some comments?
I just
Mike,
want to make
Otto, just, sorry, Kevin, we'll keep you to comment on the various countries and whatever, because I know you've done that research on them.
Last one too.
Okay.
I just want to make a comment about dancing about double-decker, about the bus height. There's a misnomer. There's certain people in Gauteng that say the 4.65 comes from the air conditioner that's used to sit on top of the bus. That's BS. Can I say? Everybody knows it.
BS means it's not true, ladies and gentlemen.
That's twice.
I was there with Jack Webster when we decided where the 4.65 comes from. It's a standard, stock standard double-decker bus in Joburg that needed that height to be able
In
to
Cape
run.
Town.
And Cape Town, stock standard double-decker bus. No air conditioner on the top. Hy trappies wat so opgeloop het, daai busse. That's where the 4.65 comes from. It's got nothing to do with anything else. The other thing is these days with bridges, as far as I know, that we in Samini found out, the minimum, standard for clearance under the bridge is 4.85. So if you keep on filling the road up, you won't get your car through under the bridge. So, roads are these days milled out under the bridge and reconstructed to keep to at least that minimum. We haven't really found out, Gavin, yet what the real height, the minimum height, construction height is, but from phone call, which our minimum height it was 4.85. So.
Thanks, Otto. So what he basically said was that double-decker height came from the steps that walked up like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, all right, that's a direct translation. Okay. So I think that puts that story in terms of what Don had raised about the double-decker buses. But what's important is around the bridge clearances, where there's been a lot of chat around that. Liesel then raised the question around Zim and Zambia having gone back to the 4.3 meter restriction. Now, we can ask both Mike and Kevin to chat about that. So let's start with you, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, and this is very recent, is that they, in fact, are allowing 4.6 high. And the fact that a lot of containers, as we speak today and yesterday, are moving across those borders at 4.6 tells me that's correct. I don't hear, unless you gentlemen, ladies might know more, but I don't hear of any trucks being impounded in those countries. So as far as I know, 4.6 is acceptable there. And the question, as I understand it, Liesl, is what happens to those guys loading legally in their own countries and arriving here? And if everything you hear is correct from the department, they will be pulled off the road and fined.
No.
And told to reduce themselves. So, all of those things are possible, but the real point about this is for that to happen, all the municipalities and provincial traffic departments have to get on board as well. Now, the department, as far as I understand it, can't go and force a municipality to start fining trucks. They can request them to do it. So where this all goes, I don't know. But if it does happen on a large scale, the highways and byways in this country will come to a grinding halt.
We've got 2 minutes to go. Kevin, can you speak about one or two things that Liesl raised?
Yeah, look, so basically, let's get to the crux of the matter. I think Department of Transport needs to go and look up the Welgemoot Commission. The Welgemoot Commission in the height of apartheid was a study between taxis and buses. And of course the buses were Patca, they're owned by the government. So what came out of Department of Transport was much better to use buses, less traffic on the road. So we are going to stick with buses. Look around you. How many buses on the road, how many taxis? That's what happens when you make legislation that does not make sense, right? And that is what is going to transpire, is that if we cannot afford it, then they must recapitalize our business the same as they did with the taxis. They haven't done that, right? If we can't afford it, we're not going to move it. We're only in transport to make money, not lose money. And we're only barely surviving today. So really, when it comes to the bottom line, we're going to be left with no choice but to say we don't accept the appointment. If we don't accept the appointment, how are they going to move? That's a question that has to be asked.
You can keep talking, Kevin. I've just been told I've got another 2 hours. The other speakers haven't arrived.
Can I say something?
We've got 20 minutes.
On the international side, to answer the question there, yeah, there's a huge variety of different regulations in various countries. And as I said, the United States, for example, is certainly lower than 4.6. But Central Europe, which is mainly what concerns us, allows the height of our high cube containers. And you know that because 60% of our fruit business, for example, goes into the northwest continent, and there's no problem with those, and they all go on road. So I don't think there's anything like our legislation in Northern Europe.
Okay, Mike?
Can I just to make one point I forgot? Also for Department of Transport, there's a national. We have a thing called the SADC agreement. It's an agreement between nations, including South Africa. In that agreement, a foreigner's license is recognized in South Africa, right? Now, this is a very real danger on the high cube issue, because under the SADC agreement, our SADC partners, legal height is 4.6. They will be allowed to run a container in at a loaded height of 4.6 into our ports. A South African transporter under the new rules will not be able to. So very, very simple, right, is that they can run at 4.6, local transporters can't run at 4.6. I think we all know that a lot of people buy their license fees in Mpumalanga because it's one of the cheapest centers in the country. How long do you really think before all the South African fleets are registered in a SADC country, running containers? And can we say, really, the policeman on the ground stops the vehicle, he says, I'm a foreign vehicle, I'm a SADC vehicle, I'm allowed 4.6, and he says, but only if you take it to the border. So he says, well, then follow me, sir. How many policemen have we got to follow? They will not be able to police it.
They allowed 9 days in South Africa.
Yeah, they allowed 9 days in South Africa. Who's going to police this? Nobody's going to police this. There hasn't been the logic. And as I used to say to the late John Snell, because he used to quote it to us, I said, John, if you're unhappy with the legislation, take it up with the legislators. But realistically, what's going to transpire from this, you're going to have everybody like the Mpumalanga are going to register in the SADC countries. That's lost to a whole license base of all the different provinces. They're going to operate in South Africa. Nobody's going to be able to police it because nobody's going to be able to make sure that that particular container does not leave our borders in 7 days. So it's going to be Wild West territory. And then I come from a place called New Delhi, right? We've got very good trader manufacturers there. And one of them came up with a very, very good point. He said, we got backyard trailer operators. How long before they butcher those vehicles? They cut their beams, right? And then they give it a paint job, what's called in Durban a paint overhaul. Looks beautiful, right? But it's an accident waiting to happen. Do we really expect our police to know what is a good modification against a bad modification? They're not experts. There's the expert, but the man in the police uniform, he's not the expert. So what are we going to see? More trailer failures, because people are going to be butchering things and taking things out that we need for safety reasons. They're going to fail, they're going to break in half, we're going to have more accidents, we're going to have more damage to our infrastructure, and we're going to have more deaths, right? So unless the Department of Transport actually starts to listen to us as an industry, right, they've got to see this is what's going to result. We're going to have a butchered fleet running on the road, which is going to push our accidents right through the roof. We're going to have other people registering outside of South Africa so they can run the 4.6 anyway, right? All for what? It constitutes no danger. We've been running them for 20 years. We have one person in Department of Transport who says his last resort is that we're going to hit bridges. And my question to him is quite simple, right? When the bus is going down the road or the car carrier is going down the road with the permit, does the road sink and the bridge lift for them to go underneath? But I come with my high cube and it stands resolute. Come murmi, right? Absolute nonsense. That is an absolute fairy tale. And Department of Transport must start listening to us, because I can tell you now, if we turn around, much like the Welkom Commission, when the taxi operator said to Department of Transport, we will run our taxis. By the 1st of January, our fleets are not going to be upgraded. We will not be able to run those containers, and the problem is going to be a South African problem. I'm saying, why must we embarrass ourselves? Because I've given you, there's already, because I come from Durban, I mix amongst the community there, and they always think of how can we circumvent the law? How can we get around it? I've just told you what they're going to do. They're going to chop their trailers, they're going to butcher them, which is going to be horrendous for this country, and they're going to register those vehicles outside of South Africa, which is going to be horrendous for our as a national fiscus and our provincial fiscus. That is going to be the end result of this nonsense. Thank you.
Otto, Sampi raised something around permits and abnormal loads, and I think where Sampi was going with that is that in the TRH11 you're not allowed to transport, not allowed to put twist locks onto abnormal load vehicles. Sampi, is that where you were going with that?
Yeah.
More or less? So that even if you went and built these now step decks.
To be honest, what the guys do, before, can I mention his name, the guy in Gauteng, so Iridia. Before he goes and measures the trailer, the twist locks are not there. After he's been there, the twist locks just sort of arrive.
Magic.
On the trailer. All right?
So the bottom line, what you're saying is, where Sampi is raising a question as to, you now go and build this, and legislation currently exists that says you may not put twist locks onto that vehicle.
Are they?
So therefore you are not legally allowed to transport this container. You're going to push people into becoming illegal and unlawful.
And the other thing is, I mean, like, you can get a 12-meter container, but you will not get a permit to transport a container on an illegal vehicle.
Correct, yes.
Not in Gauteng or in KwaZulu-Natal. You won't get a permit. It just purely won't give it to you.
Can I also point out something to you? There's a section in the Road Transportation Act, the same act we're referring to. It says you may not load a container onto a vehicle unless it is fitted with container locks. Now, have you heard of a thing called a flat rack? Now, we're not talking 40 foot and 20 foot. A flat rack is 1 meter of steel where they put a machine on it because it weighs 35 tons. It can only move on an abnormal vehicle under permit. It's 36 tons, 40 tons, right? But it's got 4 container locks. Now they say with abnormals, oh, we can't fit a container lock. Which section of the law does the Department of Transport want us to comply with? No container locks on abnormal vehicles? Then how the hell do you move a flat rack? Because the law says you can't move it unless you fit it with a container lock. We can't have it both ways. And there's a lot of illogical things in the Act that have to get sorted out. You know, we were allowed to move containers at 2004, 2005 under a thing called a period permit. They used to just give it to us as a piece of paper and we moved the containers. When we said, what are we spending this money for? This piece of paper doesn't make it any more safe. Then somewhere along the line, the whiz kids in the background said, we will not grant a permit for a container. Why? It makes no sense. There's a lot of illogical decisions and laws being made which don't make any sense. And that's why we as an industry are reaching a point, and I got to the point because I'm at retirement age now. I'm saying, let them reap what they want. You want to bring it in? Then you know and betal, mate. Because when the country comes to a standstill, don't look at me, look in the mirror, you'll see who's at fault. And I've just reached the end of my tether, and that's why I normally don't sit on these panels, because I call a spade a bloody shovel.
There we go. That's a spade is a rather sharp instrument. We had one last question from Gerard, which I think is what we need to deal with now, and that is, you know, there is this little other urban legend running around that for the last 7 years we've done nothing. And now we're waiting for the final 11th hour and marshalling all the voices and what have you. Yeah. So I think let's have some comment around that. And you've been pretty quiet, Mike, for a while, so we're going to give you an in on that.
I want to answer Gerard's question because I did some research. In Europe in 2011, there was a study about their river traffic where they changed the heights of some old bridges to allow the high cube containers through. And in Europe, a river the transport is very often on the river system. It's one thing that we don't have, which is why our logistics costs are higher than many other countries that have these river systems. It's allowed on the rail, and all highways and big tunnels on highways are made in such a way that the high cube. So it could be that you can go to a small village or a part of town that you're not allowed to go with a high cubed, and you'd have to unload it before them. But the guys have got their warehouses and so on near highways, near rivers, near railway tracks, and all those sort of things. So everywhere major in Europe, these things go. And then I don't have the law in China, but I came across a very interesting statistic, which says to you in China this is also happening, and also in Asia as such, because Asia has got its own palette dimensions in many cases, and so on. But in China, there's 103 million container movements a year, right across China, and so on. And if we're right, about 70% of these containers are already high-cubed, so on, then it means by just those statistics, high-cube containers go through China anyway. So I don't read Chinese, but I read statistics. And I'm saying to you, 103 million containers, you cannot get that sort of container movement if it's not going to allow high-cube containers. So in answer to Gerard's question, at least 2 of our major trading partners allow high-cubed virtually, right through the country. And that just says to you, we're not going to change Europe, we're not going to change China. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay, I think, Mike?
Yeah, just a quick one on that. I mean, as SAF, we have produced a fairly substantial dossier on this, and that will show the dates and times of all the engagements that we have had while we have supposedly been doing nothing. So there is a lot, and you've all been involved in a lot of that, so you know about that. So that will be accessible. And on behalf of Fruit South Africa, who also happens to be a member of SAF, Dave Watts, who apologizes for not being here today, I think you know he has some problems, he's done a huge exercise for them, which will also be coming out fairly shortly, because they have the resources and the sense to see what an impact this will have on their business. So I wouldn't say all is lost yet, but there has to be some meaningful engagement with the Department of Transport.
There's a report that I got a copy from Shamini that actually lists all of them from January, some long time ago.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about.
3 pages of, we gave a letter of as a rebuttal, which you guys are in the process of distributing. And I had it drafted by the guy that did the original consultation on the original study in 2005. And he's used by Department of Transport extensively. In actual fact, he wrote your national road strategy. 99% of what's in that, you've just had it voted through Parliament and you're now launching it, was written by this particular consultant. That's why I got him to answer the letter to the Minister of Transport, because you obviously trust his opinion. So he gave the whole history of it, and that will be going to the Minister to answer the letter he sent to the MEC down here. And then I think you have requested a meeting where we can sit down and discuss it. But the bottom line is, it's totally unaffordable. We cannot afford it. Nobody's in business to lose money or close their doors. Anybody who thinks that they can make money by buying a fleet of special load trailers, and let me tell you, it is possible. We have a design. We've had people building down in Durban, but it's a very expensive trailer. For starters, it needs air suspension. Air suspension now, don't have to tell you, it's extra 50 grand, 60 grand on top of your transport price, on top of your cost for a trailer. It is possible. It has to use imported steels. It's very expensive. It takes an extra 2 days to build. I don't have to tell you what time costs. It is possible to get one of these trailers. But is it financially possible? And the simple answer, it's not. And really, with the best will in the world, right, the best will in the world, we as an industry, maybe certain clients have certain projects, they can afford to buy them, and we know of 1 or 2 people who are buying them. But we're talking about high-cube containers that move throughout South Africa, right, which is a hell of a lot of containers moving right throughout the country. There is a trailer that is available that can be used, but it's unaffordable to the industry as a whole. And I've been in it for 20 years, and I can tell you now, I'm walking away from it. 1st of January, if they say I need to have a specialized trailer, I can't afford it, I just don't accept the appointment. And the ports then close down when they get congested, and the shipping lines want to know what to do with their containers, then it's everybody else's problem and no longer transporters' problem. That's how I solved it last time.
The other thing that we can think of is, first of all, we're just talking about transporting high-cube containers on our main routes between Durban and Joburg and wherever. I think there's more being transported on skeletal trailers in and around Joburg, for instance, from what's it, they're in
City Deep.
City
Yeah.
Deep. Okay? Those things also have to go somewhere. And there is routes where those trailers can't go because the bridges are marked. You cannot get under me with your trailer. I am only 4.2 high. And they don't hit those bridges. The people know where they are. So we must think about that movement as well. It's not only the movement, and that the movement inside the cities, that can be done illegally very easily.
Well, thank you for that point. We won't discuss that point. But the bottom line is this, is that this movement of high cube containers is around the whole country as such.
Exactly.
It isn't just down a corridor. Liesel, did we answer your question? You were trying to...
Can I make another point on it?
One last question. Because the argument can be made by the that you have been lawless around this issue from the beginning. Because they say the moratorium, this isn't a new law, it was always the law, and you weren't following it at 4.3, which then they put the moratorium in to, you know, that's the impasse that Mike was referring to. So why did the transport industry
Can I
not
answer
do...
that?
Yes, please, Kevin. From the beginning, why did you not have these trailers from the very get-go when the law was instituted 20 years ago?
All right, if I can answer that. When we had a height of 4.1 that went to 4.3, it was alluded to earlier. That was when we changed from 8.2 tons an axle to 9 tons an axle. We went to bigger payloads, so we had thicker necks on the trailers. There was a lot of technical reasons of why we went from 4.1 to 4.3 because of the mass. Over time, because when containers started, they were all GPs, they were all normal height. Then the high cube started trickling in, trickling in, trickling in. We had developed the Superlink, the 6 meter, 12 meter. They used to run GP boxes. Then all of a sudden they started to get these high boxes, but we had the height built for the payload. The reason why our trailers are higher than they used to be 25 years ago is that we beefed everything up. That's why our trailers are higher, all our loading ramps are higher. And when they first brought up their concerns, it was we were going to hit the overhangs of service stations. We were going to, they had a list of 5 or 6. Over the years, we have answered every one of these. We've appointed consultants who've done international studies. We've presented it all to them. Then their last concern was the stability issue, which the RFA and Otto got involved in. They did testing. They went back and proved that there was no longer a stability issue. So we had ticked over the period. You want to know what we were doing as an industry? We answered every one of their concerns. Now they have one concern left. Don't forget, 20 years we've been moving them, no problems. One concern left, we've answered all the rest. Their concern is, which I call the refuge of a scoundrel, that when you resurface the road, you're going to hit the bridge. Have we not been resurfacing roads for the last 80 years? Or is this a new invention that we're going to now start resurfacing? It's a refuge of a scoundrel. It's not a valid reason. If it's not a valid reason, what the hell are we discussing it for?
Okay, thank you.
I-
I think I'm going to let you do your final closing statements. I'm going to start with Mike here and go through that way. Mike.
Thanks, yeah. I mean, really just picking up on that, Liesel's question, and the department's attitude, and there's some logic in that, is to say that you've done nothing for the last 7 years. Now, for a start, we can show what we have done, and that's fair enough. But the real problem is, and we blame ourselves for this as well, that at the time, nobody minuted what had been discussed. Our understanding was, let the department analyze the situation and see if it is a real problem. Their understanding was, let the industry go out and start spending money. And we've never solved that impasse, haven't got to it. And just as a final thought, on any given day in the country, there are, I'd guess, around about 10,000 containers moving, something like that. So 4 million a year, yes, that would make sense, yeah. And of that, a high percentage are high cube. So the impact of a sudden ban and shutdown has to be seen to be believed, and maybe that's what it needs.
Kevin?
I've said enough.
Mike?
I've just got something. When I spoke to Kevin, I asked, and he told me that a container has a lifespan of about 10 years. So you must remember the containers from 97 are gone for 10 years already. And the whole industry, if you read the Drewry maritime research reports and everything, 90% of the containers right now being made today are high-cubed, and this is worldwide. So this is not something that the South African transporters thought up or anything like that. It seems to have become the de facto standard worldwide, and it's happening. And there's no way that we can turn this around. So it's not really useful to say what happened then and what happened and so on. This is what's happening now. How does South Africa adjust to the rest of the world? Because the rest of the world is not going to adjust to South Africa. That's as simple as it is.
Otto?
The only comment I can make is I don't even want to think in my wildest dreams what all this will cost the country if we have to comply.
Well, thank you very much. Otto van Griethuizen, Mike Schussler, Kevin Martin, Mike Walkrein, and your host, Gerard, myself, Gavin Kelly. Thank you very much for listening to us. We'd just like to thank you for being prepared to answer some of those tough questions. Given it's a kit.
Not me, I don't think.
It's a kit on how to change your truck down to
How to make it
manual.
lower.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Let's give them a hand of applause then. Just maybe some last comments that I think we just need to remember is that historically a large number of container movements is also done by smaller companies, and a lot of them are also some of our emerging operators, and the impact this could have on that sector does not really bode very well for transformation in the sector. So maybe just a last point that we need to think of.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a little bit of a bonus because we were not entirely sure whether the next speaker, that's Thabo Tsoletsane, was going to be able to make it, and gladly he has been able to make it, and we're going to squeeze him into our program. And so certain speakers have said they'll cut theirs slightly short, and Thabo himself said he'll keep it short. So Thabo is from what's the RTIA, which is the Road Traffic Infringement Agency. And it's obviously very topical in that we're going to be talking about ARTO shortly thereafter, and the infringement agency are going to be the people who basically monitor the ARTO Act. Okay, so we're glad to have Thabo Tsoletsane here to talk to us. So please can we welcome Thabo on the stage. Thank you, Thabo.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As you have heard, my name is Thabo Tsoletsane. I'm the Chief Operations Officer in the Road Traffic Infringement Agency. Apologies for landing late. There was a little bit of a mix-up. However, I need to just give you a background on the ARTO. As most of you would have heard that this ARTO is being implemented in the 2 metros in Gauteng, and the process started way back in 2008, and the purpose of that was just to find out what this monster has to do, what are the systems that are required, what are the issues related to such implementation. Yes, we did implement, and there was a lot of challenges that we faced. The system itself, the forms that we are using, the processes and procedures, and we had to assess all those. And believe you me, there was a 3,000-page document that shows all the flaws within the system. As a result, we, since 2011, started to work on changing all those things. The 3 main issues was the system. The National Contravention Register is embedded within the e-NETIS. As a result, some of the things had to be redone. operational efficiencies. Most of you would go to Johannesburg and they would send you from pillar to post, not knowing what to do. There were some legislative challenges related to how we do things on ARTO. From this, we actually had to go on and ask Parliament to change some of the legislative issues that needed to be dealt with. You'll remember that there's been a challenge of people receiving their infringement notices because the Act, which is very archaic, it was written in 1998. At that time, an email was a business-like tool, but as we all know, almost everybody has an email, but the Act still says we must send these things through registered mail. And the Act actually says all these notices must be delivered at the post office, and then once they've been stamped, it's then when we accept that they were sent to you. So it's very archaic, so we had to work on how do we update the systems, how do we update the law, and how do we deal with those that relate to post office issues, as well as the capacity of municipalities to deal with this. So from that, we came up with an amendment bill that looked at a couple of issues to improve manner of service of documents, to add certain functions, and repeal certain obsolete provisions. And we also had to provide for rehabilitation programs, as well as making sure that we have what you call an appeals tribunal. Now, you have heard on the news, once ARTO bill was in Parliament, there were a lot of people that are saying it's unconstitutional. And I still say people use unconstitutionality and they like to use the Constitution selectively. Now I'll speak on this issue of service of document and the appeals tribunal, and then I can stop there. Please note, what the Act now, that is before Parliament, provides for is that those who will prefer to have their infringement notices sent via email, they will register those email addresses, and then we can send through email. And this is in line with Electronic Communication Transaction Act, and it says we can actually serve these notices via that platform, and it will be accepted as proper service. Now, you must also remember that road safety is part of the things that can be classified by the state as a security issue. As a result, at some point, we may look at how do we get information under POPI, Protection of Private Information, get information from all sources to actually serve you with notices on your email. That is a possibility that we're looking at, because we all know South Africans, they don't like to receive their infringement notices. They don't. All they want to do is infringe. If they have to bear the consequences, they don't want to. Now, we are looking at making sure that people who infringe the law must actually be punished appropriately. And I repeat, people who break the law. Those who don't break the law, they don't have to worry about ARTO. A lot of people are saying, this ARTO will never work, and I'm saying nothing is impossible. We've worked on the processes, we know what are the issues, and we believe that it will work. We will serve through electronic means, we'll serve through post office, even though it's not working properly. Where we can, we will. Now, please note ARTO, as I said, is meant for people who break the law. It's not meant for people who just drive on our roads in a manner that they should. Mention is made when ARTO is talked about e-tolls. Now, please note, e-tolls and ARTO, they don't mix. There is no way that we are going to collect toll fees as RTIA. However, this is how it works. If you look at the National Road Traffic Act, you'll find that there's a sign. There's a sign that says to you, you need to pay e-tolls. It is there. Now, how ARTO works is that you don't obey a sign. And when you don't obey a sign, you receive an infringement. So e-tolls says you must pay e-tolls. If you don't pay e-tolls, after a number of days, it means you did not obey a sign. The 50 cents, 250 cents, 3 rands, 8 rands that you should have paid, it's got nothing to do with RTIA. The RTIA, through the issuing authority in Gauteng, which will be the Department of Community Safety, will issue on behalf of Sanral what you call an infringement notice that you did not abide by the sign. Now the RTIA will follow up on you having broken the law, not on you not having paid X amount for traffic, for e-tolls. Okay? So we are not collecting the R2.50, R7.50, no. What we are collecting is infringement notice penalties. Let me come to appeals tribunal. In terms of administrative law, everybody who's affected by administrative action must be subjected to a fair, procedurally fair process. Now, ARTO, as its name says, administrative adjudication, it's an administrative process. Now, some people, some time back, they actually wrote ARTO Act because they wanted it to be administrative, but they also brought in the criminal procedure process within the administrative process by bringing in an election to go to court. Now that's absurd because this is administrative. So all we are doing now, we are taking out the election to go to court and replacing that with an appeals tribunal. Because in terms of administrative law, if you are not satisfied with the outcome of an administrative decision, you need to have somewhere to go, and then it must be reviewed by a competent authority. So that appeals tribunal will be an independent body that will review those decisions, particularly of representation officers where your infringement or your representation was unsuccessful. If you are not happy about that decision, then you can lodge your review application to the appeals tribunal. The intention, ladies and gentlemen, is just to make sure that you have somewhere to go in case you are not happy. Right? Some people quote the Constitution and say it is unconstitutional. Let me remind you, in the Constitution, there's Section 35 that talks about an accused person and that person's rights. In ARTO, we are talking about an alleged infringer. The same Constitution, if you go back and read it, you'll find that Section 33 actually talks about administrative processes. They must be fair, and you must have a body that you can actually review. So there is nothing, absolutely nothing unconstitutional, because that appeals tribunal is in line with Section 33 of the Constitution and not Section 35. Thank you very much.
We must thank Thabo for sort of informing us of some of the arguments that that are being put forward. But obviously we're going to hear from now Advocate Kevin Hopkins, who will put some of the issues that are concerning some of our members about the Act. And just to inform everybody, the ARTA means the Administrative Adjudication of Road Traffic Offences. Okay. Obviously, we're concerned. There is the concern about the infringement on what may be considered your constitutional rights. But what is problematic for us in the industry and us as drivers on the roads is that this all involves the points demerit system, whereby if you incur too many demerits, I think it's if you exceed 12 in a particular year, your license can be taken away from you. And numerous issues with that. We look at our drivers, our truck drivers, who spend far more time on the roads, and obviously they drive both in their personal capacities and they drive professionally, and they don't get any extra demerit points that account for the time that they spend on the roads, and obviously concerned about our drivers having their licenses removed from them. So this Act is now due to be implemented, and although the Road Freight Association strongly supports safety on our roads and the correct driving behaviors, we have our concerns as to the constitutional rights that we might believe, because it comes across as though the approach is you're guilty until proven innocent. So we'd like to see if that can be rectified. Obviously, we would all like to see our taxis sort of start to obey the law, and we hope that maybe this Act could induce that the taxis do behave the law. Other concerns, for the industry is that it just could result in increased inducement for bribery, which is obviously not what we'd like to see. But I'd like to then ask Advocate Kevin Hopkins to come up and give us a brief overview and obviously concentrate on our constitutional rights. If I can ask Kevin to come up, please, Kevin. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thanks very much to Thabo also for explaining some of the important aspects. So I think there are some constitutional concerns. Whether or not they're real is something that we should chat about now. But the point that Thabo made, which I think is really where any debate should start from, is the fact that traffic infringements always used to be a criminal matter. So they used to be a criminal matter, and now they've been taken out of the criminal process and put into an administrative process. So before we can understand what the constitutional issues might be, it's relatively important just to understand a little bit about criminal law. So if I can just take 5 minutes, just talk a little bit about that, and then to talk a little bit about administrative law, and then we can see if we can find any difficulties. 3 principles, I think, are central to any constitutional order for criminal lawyers. So the very first one is that when you commit a crime, you can't be convicted unless the state can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you've committed the crime. So that's the first thing. State's got to prove that you committed the crime. Now, when we talk about that, there are 2 things. First of all, what is it exactly that the state has to prove? And then secondly, how convinced does a judge need to be that you've actually committed the crime? So let's talk about both of those 2 things quickly, because they both feature quite prominently. Remember, traffic infringers were dealt with under criminal law, so this was the process that always used to apply to them. So the very first one is beyond a reasonable doubt. So what does that mean? Well, it really means that the state's got to come forward and it's got to prove that you've committed the crime. You don't have to say anything. So in our Constitution, we've got two important rights. The first is the right that you've got to be presumed innocent. You don't have to say anything when you go to a criminal trial. You've got the right to remain silent. That's the second one. So if the state's going to convict you, let's have a look at Oscar Pistorius. If the state's going to convict somebody of committing a crime, that accused person, Oscar, can either decide that he's going to give evidence, in which case he exposes himself to cross-examination, and he may be shown to be a liar, or he can exercise his right to remain silent. So those are two fairly important and fundamental issues of any criminal legal system. So, even if you choose to remain silent, the state has got to then produce the evidence to show that you committed the crime. And it doesn't have to produce any old evidence. It's got to show beyond a reasonable doubt. So what that means for lawyers is we very often see the scales of justice depicted in most emblems of legal firms and courts. All that means is that in a civil matter, for example, when one company sues another, one company puts its evidence over here, and the other one puts its evidence here, and whichever way the scale tilts, on that balance of probabilities, one party will win and the other one will lose. In a criminal matter, it's quite different, because in a criminal matter, the state's evidence has got to be so heavy that the scale must tilt all the way. You can put whatever evidence you like here, but if it doesn't give enough weight to demonstrate that there's reasonable doubt, the state has proved its case. The minute you, as the accused person, can put some evidence here, you shift the scale a bit, and if you've created enough doubt, then you can't be convicted. Maybe that's why Oscar decided to give evidence, because everything physically looked like it was stacked against him. And he realized that in order to shift the scale, he had to come and give some kind of evidence. So let's talk about O.J. Simpson briefly. You'll remember the evidence with O.J. Simpson was overwhelming. He was put at the scene of the crime. He knew both of the two people that were killed. He had a fight with them the same day that they were killed. When the cops tried to get hold of him, he got in that white Bronco and he drove away. Everything looked as though this was the conduct of a guilty man. But then what happens is one of the important pieces of evidence that the prosecutors put into their scale was the glove. And if you can remember, the prosecutor said these are the gloves that were worn by the person who killed those two. And those gloves didn't fit OJ. They were too small. So that was enough to create reasonable doubt, because OJ's lawyer said, well, if those are the gloves that the murderer wore, well, they don't fit me, so I couldn't have been the murderer. And that's enough to create reasonable doubt. Now, what seems important over here is just to remember, again, going back to Arto, that prior to Arto, all traffic infringers were dealt with under that system. The state had to prove that you committed the offense. The state had to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And the only other thing I wanted to mention to you is, what does it mean? What exactly do you have to prove? Well, you've got to prove that a rule of law was broken. So in criminal law, what that means generally is two things. You prove what lawyers call the actus reus, which is the actual conduct involved. And the second thing is what lawyers call the mens rea, which is that you had a criminal intent. So if I'm sweeping the floor over here with a broom, and accidentally on the backstroke I poke you in the eye, I'm not going to be guilty of assault, because although my action was there and my conduct was there and I did jab you in the eye, I didn't have any intention to do it. So intention also becomes important. So you've got to establish that the person committed the offense, or there was conduct, and you must show that the conduct was accompanied also by the intention, sufficient criminal intention. Right, then you can be convicted of a crime. That's how the criminal system works. Now what we've got is traffic infringements are removed from that system that there once upon a time was for us, and it's now put into an administrative system. So what's an administrative system? Administrative law is that body of law that regulates government officials who take decisions. So you want to apply for a license somewhere, some government official will decide whether you get your license. That becomes an administrative decision. Same thing, you want a permit. Maybe you're in the mining industry and you want mineral rights. So these are all applications that you make to the government, and some functionary sits down and decides whether or not you get your license or your permit or your rights. That's administrative. So Arto is no longer criminal, it's now administrative. So what does administrative mean? It means that under the ARTO Act, RTA has got certain functionaries that sit down. These are people called representation officers, and Tabu touched on them. And these are people who, so you'll get let's have a look at the process first of all. You'll get an infringement notice which will be served on you. And I understand that prior to the latest amendment, all infringement notices had to come to you by registered post. Tabu touched on the fact that it's an archaic way of dealing with things, and I think I agree. There are problems dealing with having to serve by registered post. First of all, it's very expensive, and the state acquires this incredible cost, and it also just isn't practical. There are other more efficient ways of dealing with people, and sometimes the law must catch up with modern realities. Maybe emails and SMSs are not the worst thing. I know that ARTA have got a big problem with it. It's not something that I feel I need to address here. But let's assume now you get your infringement notice. That infringement notice will say to you, you've gone through a red traffic light, or you've been speeding, for example. Now what happens to it? Well, you get the infringement notice, and you've got an opportunity to respond to it. So what do? You either admit that you're guilty and you pay your fine, and if you pay it within 32 days, I think they knock off 50%, Tabu. And if you don't pay it within 32 days, then you pay the full amount. But there's one other thing you can do. You can make representations. It's a written set of representations. You write to RTA and you say, but hang on a minute. You've sent me an infringement notice with a picture of a white VW Polo with a particular registration number going through a red traffic light somewhere in Port Elizabeth. You may want to turn around and say, but it's my registration number, but I don't have a white VW Polo. I drive a black Audi A3. And you come and you produce the evidence that this is your registration number, it belongs to a black Audi A3. You write to them and you say, and in any event, I wasn't in Port Elizabeth, I live in Joburg. And I was at work on that day. You make those representations to the representation officer, and he says, well, quite obviously, I can't expect you to pay a penalty. You didn't do it. You're not responsible. That's the benefit of the system of making representations. Then what happens after that is, if you don't like the decision of the representation officer, remember, under administrative law, it's a government functionary who makes a decision. So now the representation officer, your representations aren't good enough, let's say. He doesn't like them. And he rejects your representation. He'll write back to you and he'll say to you, I'm sorry, the penalty stands, you need to pay it. Now what do? Well, as Tabu tells us, there is an appeal tribunal. So within RTA, there's an administrative body which an appeal goes to. You go to the administrative body and you say, look, I've got a raw deal with this representation officer. I want somebody to please reconsider it. And that person will then reconsider it. That's your appeal tribunal. And then Tabu says that if you really don't like that decision either, then what you can do is you can review the appeal tribunal in the High Court. So if you've heard of PAJA, PAJA is just a statute that deals with reviewing administrative decisions. You normally review them because, for example, the person who took it didn't have the power to take the decision, or he didn't apply his mind to the right stuff, or he just got it wrong. Then you will review. So what happens in a case like this is previously, remember previously, road traffic infringements are dealt with under criminal law where the state must prove your guilt. Now, all of a sudden, you put into an administrative system where the minute you get an infringement notice, there is a presumption that you're guilty. The presumption is that you're guilty and that if you don't pay that, then the penalty will be enforced against you. And if you don't believe you've done something wrong, then you go to an administrative tribunal and you satisfy them that you haven't done anything wrong. But the onus is now on you. It's no longer on the state. So a lot of people come along, and I've seen, for example, I think they're the Justice Project, Tabu, they've come along, and ARTA have come along, and they've complained that this is a constitutional problem. Because under the Constitution, remember, I said to you, you've got the right to remain silent. Under ARTA, you can't keep quiet. Once you've got infringement notice, you need to come and tell them what you've done wrong. Tell them that you're innocent. And secondly, you've got the right to be presumed innocent under criminal law. Now, all of a sudden, you're presumed guilty and you need to come and extricate yourself. So both the Justice Project and ARTA have been quite public and quite vocal about the fact that this is unconstitutional because of those constitutional rights that I told you about. Quite frankly, I think they're wrong. I don't think it's unconstitutional for that reason, and the reason that I don't is because those rights apply to the criminal system. So if you're in the criminal system, you've got the right to be presumed innocent. But remember, ARTO takes it out of the criminal system and it's now in an administrative system. You can't expect still to enjoy the same protection that you had in a criminal system when you're no longer in the criminal system. To that, I would imagine people like the Justice Project and ARTO would say, but so you call it something else, and now all of a sudden you've got a whole different set of rights. That seems to be a fairly valid criticism on one level. The reason that I'm not convinced anymore that it is valid is because these kinds of tests have been leveled against other administrative bodies. So in competition law, for example, let's talk about competition law, it's very similar. You've got a competition commission who investigates whether or not you're guilty of anti-competitive conduct, like cartel behavior. If you are, you get something similar to an infringement notice, and you appear in front of an administrative body. And it's in front of that administrative body that you try to persuade them that you haven't done anything wrong. Now, there's no onus beyond a reasonable doubt, like with the OJ glove. There, it's on a balance of probabilities, like the civil standard. Yet you also get hit with penalties, like you do under the ARTO Act. So very similar challenges to the ones that ARTO want to make to the ARTO Act have failed when it comes to organizations like the competition authorities. The FSB are very similar. The FSB, again, have got an internal administrative process, and they decide whether to give you a license to trade or whether to take away a license or to deal with listings on the JSE sometimes. So a lot of these very important decisions are taken by functionaries, and if you don't like them, or if the functionaries get them wrong, or don't afford you certain procedural rights, you can review the functionary in the High Court. I agree with Tabu so far that everything seems to be fine. But where Tabu and I disagree, I think, with respect, and it's yet to be tested, I think the difficulty that I have is that when you don't like the decision that the representation officer makes at ARTO, in other words, this government functionary, when you don't like the decision, where do you go to? Tabu says you go to an appeal tribunal. It's another RTA internal organization. The difficulty with that is that RTA is largely funded by the fines that they get. So as far as I know, and it's a high amount, it's as much as 90%, I think, of the revenue that RTA need to survive must come from traffic fines. So now they've got an incentive to fine you. Does it mean that they're impartial? It might not. It doesn't mean automatically that everybody sitting on an appeal tribunal at RTA is suddenly biased, but that's not the point. The point is that in our law, it's not actual bias that creates a problem, it's even the perception of bias. And if you've got a financial interest in the outcome of a case or a dispute, you shouldn't be the decision maker. So I gave you two examples before. One of them was with the competition authorities. The other one was with the FSB. Both of those, let's talk about the competition authority. When you go on appeal internally, you've got two judges that sit on that appeal board. One of them is Dennis Davis, and the other one is Owen Rogers. They're both judges of the High Court. So you've got two judges of the High Court that hear your internal appeal. They don't have a financial interest anymore, so it's taken away from somebody with a vested financial interest. The FSB is currently presided over. The chairman of that appeal board is Louis Hurrams, who was an SCA judge for many years in Bloemfontein. So that's how they maintain their institutional independence, is they say, we'll have one level of administrative decision making, but then if you want an internal administrative appeal, we'll make sure that the people there are independent, usually retired judges. You don't have that, unfortunately, with RTA, and that's part of the problem. The way that RTA tried to respond to that, and Tabu, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I've just seen it in the press. RTA's response to that seems to be, don't worry, because if you don't like the decision of our appeal board, you can review that person to the High Court. But let's talk about an appeal, a review. This is a review under PAJA, the stuff we were talking about earlier. What that means, it's a full-blown application. You need an attorney, first of all, to help you, and you need an advocate. There are a lot of papers that get prepared. A lot of money is spent. Most PAJA applications, no matter how simple they are, will cost 200,000 or 300,000 rand. What do you want to do? So you've got a 2 or a 300 rand fine, or maybe you've got a 2 or a 3,000 rand fine. When on earth are you going to spend 2 or 300,000 rand defending it? You won't do it. So the point is that you don't really have access to court. The Constitution guarantees everybody the right of access to court to go and have your dispute resolved. Tabu will say to you, don't worry, you can go to court ultimately, but in real life you can't go to court. It's just too expensive. The stakes are too low when it comes to a traffic fine. And that's why you don't have an effective recourse to a court of law. So I think that's the problem. The other thing quickly is when it comes to Section 34 in the Bill of Rights, that's the right in the Bill of Rights. It says everyone has got the right of access to court. Tabu spoke about Section 35, which is the rights that you have if you're a criminally charged person, or Section 33, the rights you have in an administrative tribunal. What hasn't been mentioned is Section 34. It says everybody that's got a dispute can have the dispute resolved before an impartial court or an impartial tribunal. So it's fine. You can either go to court or you can go to a tribunal. The problem here is that this tribunal is not impartial. It's not independent. Why? Because it relies on the money that it's ultimately going to fine you to survive. And that's the problem. So if there were a constitutional issue, and there are tons of them that are raised by ARTA and raised by the Justice Project, I'm not sure that there are any that are particularly sort of jump out at me and I think are problematic. But this one I think might be a difficulty. And this is the one that I think should probably cause us the most concern. Thank you very, very much for listening.
So, but Kevin, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. If you could come up and take a few questions. So do we have any questions from the floor that anyone would particularly like to raise? I can see there's a hand right over there. Okay. If you could give us your question. Kevin,
thanks very much. I've got one question. You said when you go through a speed trap and da-di-da, do you still have the right to tell them it wasn't me driving? I know it's my vehicle. I'm not talking about something in PE with wrong plates. Yes, it's my vehicle, but it wasn't me. It was Joe. I'll give you the details of Joe, and you handle that. It wasn't me. I've given you those details. Is that still applicable? Thank you.
Yes, I think it is still applicable. Tabu might well be more qualified to talk about this, but it is applicable. That's where you make your representations. So you might get your infringement notice. You may get it there and then on the spot from a JMPD traffic official, for example, or you may get it via SMS or email. But either way, you are entitled to make representations. And if you weren't driving, perhaps Tabu can answer this, but if you weren't driving, I understand that you can nominate the driver and you basically shift the buck onto them.
Thanks, Advocate. Yeah, I think Advocate nailed it. You can do what you call a nomination. In most cases, the AVIs of this world, they receive these infringement notices, and their process just say, it wasn't me, it was Thabo Tsuletsane, and that notice goes to that person. So there's a nomination process where speed, for example, it's involved. But where you have been given a notice on your hand, you can't nominate because it was you who was at the scene. So nomination is still there. It's been, I think all the fleet companies, they are doing that in most cases. The problem here is other people are actually abusing the system because the election to go to court, I must admit, it's a burden. One of the things that happens is, you all know that all the traffic cases under criminal procedure, they must go through the courts, and the courts don't have time for those many, many cases. Now, what people do under the current system, they, rather than nominating a driver, there are companies that deal with, your fines. They take these things and they submit 225,000 election to go to court. In a period of a week, we have about 20,000 that has been submitted election to go to court. No court will actually deal with that. Besides, when that happens, there should be a summons that is generated and be served on the person. Now, this is the person who is a proxy, who's doing election to go to court for speed. He was not driving, but he's electing to go to court. So that's misuse of the process. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we have time for 2 more questions. There's one over here. Can we get the mic to that person? And then think, Don, we'll take a question from you then. Okay.
Hello. Yeah. I just want to understand. Hello. Yeah. I just would like to understand.
Is it working? Not
okay. Maybe closer.
There's another one coming. What?
So I want to understand, currently the system, I get it, it goes through a criminal procedure, and I assume that you get a criminal record if you are found guilty. With the change to administrative process, is that where you get a criminal record for infringement taken away, or do you still get a criminal record?
Okay. Under the ARTO process, because it's administrative, you will not receive a criminal record. It will be a demerit point against your name. However, I need to hasten and say there's categories of infringements or contraventions. There's what you call offenses. So your drinking and driving, excessive speeding. Those are not dealt with under the ARTO process. They go through the criminal process, and you can get a criminal record for that. But those that are classified are categorized as infringements, they will stay within the administrative process and no criminal record. However, please note, the current system, as it gives you the right to elect to go to court. If you have elected to go to court, you are summoned, and then you appear in court, and you are found guilty. It's a criminal record because it's within the court system, okay? That's what we want to take out of the ARTO process and leave the ARTO process administratively, but there should be those big ones that go to court, drinking and driving and so forth and so forth. Thank you.
Yeah, if you also respond,
Thank you. If I could also maybe just respond to that. I think Tob is absolutely right. You know, there's a difference between the serious stuff. When it's drunken driving, or you're driving recklessly and you kill somebody, or those are serious offenses. They need to remain in the criminal system. And then you have all the benefits that the Constitution gives you. There you've got the right to remain silent, and there you've got the right to be presumed innocent. It's the more minor stuff, the strictly sort of traffic infringement stuff that is dealt with administratively. And there you don't need this higher burden, and there you don't need all these procedural safeguards. It's something different. My only concern, and perhaps I didn't preface it, and I actually meant to do it when I started. I think the ARTO Act is a good act in its intentions. There's a lot of carnage on the roads, and I think that the Act does what it can to try and minimize that. And the demerits point system sounds incredibly punitive, but you don't fall foul of it when you obey the law. All of these things are good measures. I just think that the problem that I've got, and really it's the only problem that I've got, is I don't think that you have access to an independent forum. You've got access to a forum that's not independent. It's got a financial incentive to ensure that you get fined and that you pay your fine, and that the only next level of independence that you've got becomes very, very expensive, often too expensive. But otherwise it is a good system, and it's a very carefully thought out system. Just seems to involve a lot of administration, but it is a good system.
Right. I think we have time for one more question from Don over here. Thank you.
Garth, you touched on it just now, but it seems like the award for ARTO is going to be demerit points. It sounds like I'm still at school still, you know, merits and demerits. Nowhere is mentioned that we can collect rewards also by helping somebody on the side of the road, and I've got 2 demerits, so I only got 1 now, you know, that kind of thing. But now the driver now collects successfully his 12 points. We employed him to be a driver. He's employed to be a driver. Now he's collected the points. What do we do with that driver, Tabu? And he collects those points on a weekend when he drives his family around as well. So what do we do from a legal point of view with the driver? Because he's employed to drive the truck to earn money, to have an income. Now he's collected the points, either through my truck or through his own personal vehicle, what are we going to do?
Can we ask Tabo to answer, or try and answer? Okay.
Yeah, it's quite a difficult one because this issue of employer-employee relations, it's not within my space. However, I need to hasten and say, remember, if you drive on the road, you've got a responsibility not to commit infringements. That's your responsibility in the first place. If I were to say all the taxi drivers that you often see and irritate you on the road, they would come with the same argument and say, but you are going to lose their licenses. What are we going to say? Then let's not implement demerit points because taxi drivers who are causing havoc are going to lose their licenses. Is that the attitude? Can't be. All we're saying here is do the right thing and then you don't have to have demerit points. The reward part, this is how it works. If for any reason you got 2 demerit points, for whatever reason, and you realize that I've done something wrong, and for the next 6 months, you actually don't do anything wrong. Okay, let me correct that. You are actually not caught, because we South Africans do these things. If you are not caught for the next 6 months, at the end of 6 months, you'll be actually at 0 again. That's the reward of the program. Now, the question that you asked, we realize that there's a big issue. When these demerit points are going to be implemented, a lot of people, particularly the drivers that are always on the road, earlier on there was an issue about 12. We realized that will be a little bit problematic because they might get suspended very quick. And what we tried to design was the rehabilitation program, where people can go through a program that they can, their points can be diminished quicker than waiting for 3 months. So that's just a program that we tried to design to make sure that, but remember, you can't go for rehabilitation program twice a year. You must go once, and then if you keep on doing these things, then you're not interested in safety, then your license will be suspended. And unfortunately, there's going to be too much labor issues. But the fact is, if you're caught under a criminal procedure, if you're caught as a driver for doing something, and then you go to court, and then you are sentenced, what happens to your business? If this person is suspended, what happens to your business? So look at both scenarios that all we want here is to make sure that people behave on the roads. We are not interested in suspending people's licenses. What we are interested in is for them to actually obey the law. All right?
Okay, thanks very much. I think we must thank Tabo and Kevin for a very informative talk and gives us a full understanding. Professor Hugo, would you?
Can I just comment on Don's point? And it's about the issue of the employee. How are we going to deal with the particular employee? Is it a matter of incapacity or is it a matter of misconduct? And I think there would be a dispute about that in court in time to come. But of course, the starting point is I have a contract of employment with my employee. He guarantees to me that he or she is capable to drive and has the ability and license to do so. The employee is then acting essentially in breach of that clause, and that creates a difficulty. But ultimately, is it a matter of incapacity or misconduct? The second point is that would we place a duty on the employee to say that every time you accrue a point, whether there's a duty on you to disclose that, and whether you will then start taking disciplinary action based on that, which means that you could effectively terminate the employment before the employee gets to the 12 points, depending on how your system works. And then the last point really is that whether you will then include in that a duty to report, and if the employee is in breach of that, whether that can constitute some sort of offence. But that all the courts will have to decide on.
Okay. Okay, so that's a legal opinion from Professor Hugo Pinar. So hopefully that'll also help us. But just an appeal, I think, from the Road Freight Association. Yeah, we talked about minor infringements and major infringements, being drunk driving, etc. But I think for our drivers, this is their means of sustenance or their livelihood. So all these offences, in our instances, are major problems, put it that, but not minor offences. But thanks very much. Thanks for everybody. So it's now for me to ask Dennis Dykes, the economist from Nedbank, who's talked to us before and has the very difficult task of giving us an economic outlook for South Africa over the next short while. We've obviously got Ramaphoria that we all enjoying at the moment, but obviously, question marks international investors have as to the sustainability of the South African economy. We've got those feared rating agencies looking sternly at us, and a lot of concern about our economic future. So if I can ask Dennis Dykes to try and help us with what we should be expecting in the near future. Thanks, Dennis.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you. I've definitely learned something. I'm going to nominate my wife, but that's just by the side. Right, I'm going to speak to you about where I think the economy is at after all these momentous changes that we saw in December. If you look at the economy in the graphs, which hopefully is appearing behind me now, you'll see we've been through quite a rough phase. After democracy, we seem to be ratcheting up growth rates. At one point, we were growing at about 5.5% over half a decade. We had unemployment coming down by over 1 million people. Things looked really good. Underlying that, there were some issues, but nevertheless, as you can see, during the early 2000s up to 2007, we had very, very strong growth. The great financial crisis then happened in 2007, 2008, as you can see there, and we went into recession in 2009, very severe recession along with the rest of the world. We had the World Cup 2010, China reflated, we managed to bounce back quite nicely, and then subsequent to that, basically, growth sort of petered out. And you can see last year was a little bit better than 2016, 1.3% odd growth over the year as a whole, but nevertheless, not all that great. So, what actually was happening? Well, last year, if you look at the breakdown of growth from a production point of view and output point of view, you can actually see where all the growth came from. It was principally agriculture. I think what I'll do is I'll just try and point here. Agriculture grew by 17.7%, obviously coming out of the drought in the north of the country. Clearly, there were still problems down in this part of the world, but nevertheless, that was a big boost to economic growth. And you can see if you exclude agriculture, the rest of the economy grew by about 0.9%. So agriculture played quite a big role. Mining, which has had a torrid decade or even 2 decades or so, also bounced back with the improvement in commodity prices and global demand improving. So that was a bounce back. You can see in 2016 that actually saw quite a big contraction of a similar sort of magnitude. Finance, which also includes things like real estate, grew in a fairly pedestrian way, but nevertheless outpaced the rest of the economy. And then transport communications, which would be where your sector actually fits, grew by about 1.5%. But you can see a lot of laggards at the bottom of the scale there. Government obviously very much constrained from a budget point of view, unable to actually spend too much. The electricity sector, the utility sector, stumbling along, 0.2%, and then manufacturing actually contracting, construction contracting, and so-called domestic trade, which is wholesale and retail trade, includes things like hotels, accommodation, and so forth, contracting as well. So not a great picture at all, and very much helped by those 2 very strong sectors at the top, as I described. From an expenditure point of view, and this is a bit of a messy graph, but the blue that you actually see performing very strongly over here and just before the financial crisis That's household consumption expenditure. You can actually see that stage a little bit of a comeback during the latter half of last year. So consumers starting to show some improvement with the dip in inflation in particular, helping disposable incomes. Government consumption expenditure pretty much non-existent, as we've already described. Fixed investment spending, which is the green line, you can actually see there, very, very absent as well, compared to, again, the period just before the financial crisis. And then net exports, basically at times a positive contributor, but at other times a little bit of a negative contributor. Very bitty, not anything that you can actually point to and say, well, sterling sort of performance coming through there. Then we had the change, and those numbers all take you to the end of last year. Then we had the big change, President Ramaphosa coming through, and as you can see there, consumer confidence, I'm sure this represents the views in the room as well, I'm sure, going to new heights. Now, I must stress that I think this survey, this sample size is about 2,500, so it might have been people exiting a rugby match after their side won or something like that, but nevertheless, you can see it looks pretty euphoric. Generally, actually, the VR prefaces this by saying that they think it will actually come down in the second quarter because it's quite an extraordinary sort of rise. Business confidence in the red also saw some improvement, but as you can see, it doesn't get up to the 50 line, so suggesting that most businesses still remain fairly cautious, that being the neutral sort of figure. So consumer and business confidence improving, maybe on the business side not quite as much. The fact that we had the stronger rand through from the end of 2015 all the way through to the end of last year and into this year as well has helped bring down inflation quite significantly. Also, food price inflation has been coming down quite significantly, and that's enabled the Reserve Bank to sneak in 2 cuts to interest rates, which is always a good thing. Generally, when you start to see a declining cycle, interest rate cycle, that normally precedes an upswing by about 9 months. So, and normally it's a very, very good gauge. It aligns very closely to leading indicators. But you can actually see the cycle's been very mild. So very mild increases in interest rates compared to previous cycles. And we think that it's going to be a very mild downward cycle as well. So probably not the big injection that you'd anticipate. And probably by the time we get to the latter part of next year, we'll start to see interest rates tending a little bit higher, all things being well, because that will imply that we've started to actually see movement in the economy, the consumer will be spending, and we'll see some demand-side inflation coming through. Now, if you look at the latest indicators, and this again, very messy, but these are the sort of monthly indicators that we've got, and now we've got quite a good idea of what happened in the first quarter of the year, and it's not great. In actual fact, it's going to be a bit of a shock, we think. We think that manufacturing has come down. Well, we know that manufacturing has come down. Mining's come off. Even consumer spending, which you saw what consumer confidence did, but even consumer spending off the high base at the end of last year has come down a little bit. And it's likely that we'll see even a small decline in a gross domestic product, which will not be a great sort of message to send out there. We saw these big changes, confidence bounces back, and now we actually see some sort of slippage. Why the slippage? Well, I think it's something to do with the base. When Statistics South Africa reflected, I think, a stronger than expected growth rate in the fourth quarter of last year, and that's now coming off that very high base. We do think for the year as a whole that you're likely to see about 1.8% growth. So it's not a complete tragedy, despite the fact that you'll see a slight dip coming through there. Markets have also turned a bit sour, though. You would have seen the rand. It's been very volatile, but certainly it's come off its base, as you can see in the graph behind me. That period of very, very strong growth, improvement in the currency. We've seen some slippage coming through there. The green line behind it is quite an interesting line. It's basically developed markets, stock markets compared to developing markets, stock markets, emerging markets, of which South Africa is one. And what it suggests is that when people are moving out of emerging markets, then basically, obviously, you'd expect the green line to come down. But what's interesting, up until around about 2015, that green line pretty much mirrored what was happening in the rand. So as money moved out of emerging markets, the rand came under pressure, and so forth. In 2015, 2016, you can see a big divergence. I think that was partly what was happening in Brazil, and a lot what was happening here, obviously with Minister Nene being fired. But then the relationship starts to actually reassert itself as we go into 2017, 2018. And that's a big part of the reason why you actually saw the rand improving, despite the fact that we hadn't really seen the political developments improve. How's the rand done relative to other currencies? Well, bit of a mixed bag. This is sort of indices against the dollar from 2013. And you can see in this graph here that the rand has been kind of like middle of the path, the red one over here. This bit where you see the improvement coming through is after the ANC elective conference in December, so a big bounce back in the currency. But overall, it's kind of like middle of the pack. The two bottom performing ones would be Brazil, which has gone through its own sort of turmoils and is in another period of turmoil. And then Turkey, which has been totally chaotic from a financial market point of view. You can actually see, again, big declines in their currency, the lira coming off again in the early part of 2018. And then above us, you've got the other emerging market currencies in Europe, the Aussie dollar, which is obviously a commodity currency. That's why I've put it in as a little bit of a comparator here. And then at the top, you've got the Chinese yuan, which really is fairly closely fixed to the dollar. So that's why it's pretty close to that 100 line. So the rand's been kind of like middle of the pack, but towards the weaker end. We think it's relatively fairly valued now. Excuse me, I'm getting a bit croaky here. If you look at this from economists like to look at currencies from a purchasing power parity, which all it means is that the currency, if it was falling by the inflation rate over time, the inflation differential between us and our trading partners over time, it would follow that blue line in the graph behind me. But the real path of the rand has been followed by the green line. So you can see over certain periods it's very much overvalued and other periods very much undervalued. We've been through a period of undervaluation, obviously with particularly after the Nene incident. But it's pretty much back to where you would anticipate it would be. So it's kind of like fairly valued at this point. And if you look at bond yields, which is again very much a barometer of confidence in the economy, we've been through a very good part in the early part of 2018, but unfortunately some bounce back has taken place in the last few weeks, and we're back to kind of like pre-ANC conference levels, particularly when on the 3-year rates, but also on the 12-year, which would be the more important sort of barometer. So the financial markets, we saw some euphoria in the early part of the year, but that also seems to have died off to some degree. Another indicator that we look at, particularly when we're trying to assess what foreigners think of us, is how much they're buying in the way of South African bonds and equities on a net basis. And you can actually see, for example, on the equity side, and they look a little bit over-dramatic to me, but had some discussions with the JSE about their statistics here, but nevertheless you can actually see the big decline in purchases, or rather sales, of South African equities by foreigners from 2015 through to 2017. Some bounce back, and now it's come off slightly over the last few days, the last couple of weeks. And then as far as the bond market is concerned, foreigners have also just recently sold off. But it's interesting, over this whole period from 2006, you can actually see foreigners have bought around about, well, over 300 billion rands worth of bonds, and thereby supported our financial position, both government finances but also country finances. Thanks very much. So we're very much reliant of these portfolio capital flows coming in, and the rand would have been considerably weaker, interest rates considerably higher, had we not seen these massive inflows, particularly on the bond side, occurring over the last couple of years. Sorry about that. So, I guess the question is, what is the new reality? We've seen the political change. So what's on the plus side of the balance sheet? For me, a huge cloud has actually lifted. I have to say I'm very much more positive, particularly with the fight against corruption. So we've got Pravin Gordhan back in the cabinet, which in itself is pretty much a miracle. At one point it looked as though he was going to jail on fairly trumped up sort of things, but nevertheless. So he's back, and he's back at public enterprises, which is, I'm sure, a portfolio that he's savouring quite a lot, because he started to make some very key changes at the SOEs, as is the president, obviously, prior to his appointment. So we've seen very big changes at SAA, SA Express. The boards have all been changed up. We've seen new CEOs put in place. Eskom, we've got Pakamani Khadebi, who's very respected for what he did at the Land Bank and prior to that at Treasury. And basically he's CEO and now fully appointed as CEO at Eskom. As I say, I've got a huge amount of confidence in him. We've seen the changes at Denel, Transnet, Prasa, and there are all sorts of investigations, commissions of inquiries underway to actually look at how these operations got into so much trouble, which they did over quite a lengthy period of time, or actually a fairly short space of time, but around about a decade or so, yes, increasingly so in recent years. We've also seen the changes at SARS, with Mr. Miyani basically being put to one side and another investigation going on there. PIC, Public Investment Corporation, again, subject of investigations. Wayward provinces are being looked at, starting really, I guess, with Northwest, and you would have seen developments in the last few days there as well. The Hawks are very much back on track. We've got Godfrey Labia at the helm of that organization, and apparently he's a fine, outstanding member, long-term police officer, but very, very well qualified as well. I think he's got a PhD. And the staff look very, very much motivated again. So the Hawks, I think, are going to be somewhat motivated and aggressive in the way they're going to be looking at things. I think the change in confidence has also meant that you would expect immediate dividends to come through in certain sectors. So industries that have actually been held back by policy uncertainties, certain industries, I think you'll start to actually see some material improvements coming through. And I've put there as well, there's certain industries which I think could be very quick starters with the right sort of signals. Renewables, Eskom has just signed a whole lot of renewable contracts, which had been put aside for a couple of years, a lot of uncertainty in the industry. We know that that is going to mean immediate investment because all those projects have been examined. They've been on the table for some time, and they're going to be very quick starters. So fixed investment spending, foreign direct investment, and employment is going to come through very, very quickly. We think as well that, mining, if we had a proper mining charter, which everyone actually bought into, and the final look at the bill looked actually quite acceptable, that you could actually see very strong fixed investments spending coming through in that sector, providing obviously it was a conducive policy environment. So, and then lastly, we've got our ambassadors running around the world looking for $100 billion US dollars over 5 years in new investment. Just to put that $100 billion US dollars into context, so it's I guess about 1.2 trillion rand over 5 years, it would imply that fixed investment spending would rise by around about 13-14% per annum over that whole period. It's not impossible. We have actually seen it in the past. The 2003 to 2006-07 period, we experienced a similar sort of level of improvement in fixed investment spending, but it would be a very, very strong, it's a very ambitious target, let's put it that way, particularly if it's only going to come from foreign direct investment. I suspect that a lot of it would also come from domestic companies, but more of that a little bit later on. So that's the good news. I think the fight against corruption has been very public. It's actually been coming through very quickly. But we do think, though, that there's been massive damage caused over the last 8-10 years or so. Even since 2014 or so, we think that around about R500 billion has been lost in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, output in the economy. And to put that in context, if you bear in mind that our overall sort of tax rate for the economy is around about 30%, that implies that the fiscus would have got about 150 billion rand less in cash. And you could have paid for Medupi in cash, had that been the case, had they managed to finish it on time, obviously. But it's an enormous sum of money that has been foregone by the fiscus and obviously the general economy as a whole. Probably, and these are conservative numbers in my view, around about 600,000 jobs lost as a result of that much weaker sort of GDP trend. How do we calculate these figures? Well, one way of doing it is looking at how similar economies performed over the same period of time, where they didn't have all the political and policy damage that we actually incurred. That's one way of looking at it, and then we've also cross-checked it with other sort of measures. So we think that the damage has also been very structural. It's going to take a lot of time, determination to actually sort out. We think that there's an infrastructure and investment deficit that's quite apparent. The problem with investment and jobs is that they tend to be lagging indicators. So you first of all have economic growth, and then they tend to actually follow once you start to actually have capacity limits being reached. They don't actually happen in advance of economic growth itself. Financial and fiscal holes in the SOEs in particular. I mean, Eskom, SAA, we've seen the news, the headlines over the last little while. SAA looking for another 21 billion rand to get back to health over the next couple of years. I must admit, if you gave me 21 billion rand, I think you could have started a whole new airline without any of the baggage there, but it is just an enormous sum. And I think the key problem in a lot of these state-owned enterprises is that their cost structure is so unwieldy. So if you're paying more for jet fuel than your competitors, if you've got staff levels that are 30, 40, well actually probably 50, 60% higher than comparator airlines around the world, you cannot expect to actually compete in an industry where basically the margins are actually relatively thin, and you're going to make billions of losses over time. In the case of Eskom, at one point they were buying diesel from dentists in the Eastern Cape. I mean, the mind boggles. And we know that even now, today, that they are running those diesel generators at great cost, and at great cost to yourselves, because that will come through in a back claim for higher tariffs in a year or two's time. You just wait and actually see. And that's been because of coal shortages, which again are around logistic issues, which could have been avoided. Plus shaky mine suppliers like Tegeta, which obviously cause a lot of problems in the system. I think as well, we've had institutional damage, obviously police clearly, but right at grassroots levels, not only at high levels, intelligence services, the current public protector, I think we've actually seen difficulties there as well. We've seen cultural damage, and by that, it's interesting hearing the conversation a little bit early on, but I mean, people basically don't want to pay taxes, they don't want to pay fines, they don't want to pay tolls. So basically we've got a culture of non-payment. Everyone wants to actually avoid their responsibilities in society, with the difficulty that you've got an ever-decreasing tax base and an ever-increasing compliance base as well. And that fundamentally eats into a society. We don't want to get to a situation like Nigeria, where even public servants don't pay as you earn. Around about 16% pay personal tax, which is completely bizarre, and makes the system completely unmanageable. And then, of course, we've had the reputational damage through things like rating downgrades and so forth. So just to put it in context, this is growth in per capita income, both real in red and in the blue is nominal, which means with inflation. from 2010 to 2017. And you can actually see South Africa is third from the bottom. It's not a great sort of picture. At the top, you've got Ethiopia, so a very different sort of economic model. Not one I'd necessarily suggest we follow, but where compliance is forced more on an authoritarian sort of level. But you've also got countries like Rwanda, which has done exceptionally well. Malaysia, obviously, Mauritius, another Southern African peer. And you can see we are very, very much down the line. So what happened is, everyone was very badly affected by the financial crisis. We all bounced back around about 2020 to about 2012, and then South Africa has basically slipped very rapidly subsequent to that. What about employment? Well, this graph here just shows you employment in different sectors. The blue line at the bottom here is total employment in the economy. So you can see it's fairly flat. The red line is employment in the private sector. And you can see there it is basically where it was in 2008, if you look at this, the quarterly employment survey. So no growth in employment in the private sector. The growth in employment has come from the public sector, principally electricity. You can see there where there was significant growth in utilities, public sector utilities. I won't show you what happened to wages during that period, but it really escalated very, very significantly. And then general government saw the strongest growth in employment over that period. The difficulty of course, is that the red line is supporting the purple line at the top there. These aren't employment levels, incidentally. Public sector employment is lower than private sector employment on an absolute level. This is just showing you the trends since 2008. What about debt? If you look at government debt from 2009, and again, part of this was the damage caused by what actually happened during the financial crisis. The commitment by government was to actually spend a significant amount of money on infrastructure to try and actually lift the economy up. Also has the advantage of being very much once off, but in reality, a lot of it went into wages and salary increases in the public sector. And we basically are looking at around about 56%, hopefully as the peak in debt in the early 2020s. But obviously that number is concerning given the levels of interest rates and compared to other emerging market economies. And then the other sort of barometer of where we start from is the sovereign ratings downgrades that we've seen over the last 5-6 years. Where we started with Moody's actually rating us as an A country and basically managing to avoid a downgrade into sort of so-called junk status. And you can see Moody's has put us on a stable outlook. Standard & Poor's, which have got us most negatively rated at the moment, have kept us on this rating here. So basically, we're still on a double B as far as they're concerned. Which puts us in sub-investment grade, and Fitch also have us in sub-investment grade. Now, typically that will take, if you look at the international evidence, some countries bounce back after 2 years if they've done everything right, but it typically takes about 5 years to get back into investment grade, which implies that we're going to be spending more on the debt than we would otherwise have done, and that it's going to be more expensive for not only government, but also the private sector. So obviously that has to be reversed. Just another element, I mentioned the infrastructure story. If you look at Eskom electricity, that's the blue line. These are gigawatts produced, 12-month moving average over time. And you can actually see that Eskom is still producing at around about 2006 levels, despite a 300% increase in the electricity price, and of course a lot of investment that has gone into the sector. It's been very much bailed out, and I say this in all seriousness, by the renewables, other independent power producers. You can see as a proportion of the total has actually increased quite significantly and enabled them to run their plant at lower capacity levels, which allows them basically to put the right maintenance in place. As you know, in the truck industry, if you're running a truck all the time, Clearly, that's not advisable. At some stages, you have to take it to one side and do a service. Otherwise, you're going to run into all sorts of problems. And that basically is what happened to Eskom a few years ago. And then just another sort of indicator of the difficulties over the last couple of years, and it's a demonstration of what can actually happen if things go wrong. From a policy perspective, this is mining exploration in South Africa. It's a fixed investment measure produced by the Reserve Bank, South African Reserve Bank. And you can actually see that after the mini boom that we saw in exploration just during the super cycle in commodities, basically exploration has collapsed, which is not a good thing because clearly that means that you're not going to see that sector performing very well over the next few years unless this line picks up very, very dramatically. And then just lastly, if you look at land reform, which is very much a hot topic at the moment, and this is a graph I've taken from the high-level panel, which is a parliamentary panel. Mr. Motlanthe, basically a former president, actually was the head of this panel. It just shows you amount of land transferred in hectares per annum in terms of the land reform programs, and you can basically see a collapse taking place after 2007. And although there were some budget issues, this is not the prime reason for why this actually collapsed. It was mainly as a result of, and the report says it, so it's not me saying it, basically there was huge government inefficiency and ineffectiveness in this area which led to this big decline. And that of course is laid the seeds for the issue that we're currently debating. So that's some of the baggage that we've collected over the last 10 years or so, which is going to make it very difficult to move forward fast. What are the keys going forward though? What do we think can actually get us going and really going quickly as an economy? So I think for me, the fight against corruption has to continue and even intensify. The Commission on State Capture, we had a news conference, I think, last week, has got off to a very, very slow start, in my view. I was hoping that would be kind of like reaching conclusion stage by the end of the year, but apparently they're going to get their first witness in August. And the commission basically, or rather the judge, was at pains to say a very complicated process, wants to get all his ducks in a row and so forth. But nevertheless, just hope that that actually accelerates so that we can get to the bottom of some of these issues and then move on. There are a lot of people that seem to have done a lot of wrong things and are still walking around, both in the public and the private sector. So that's a little bit disheartening. And then I think the MPA head, who proved himself to be incredibly ineffective, that's my impression anyway, needs to be sorted out fairly quickly. But these things I think will happen, so I'm not particularly concerned about them. The bigger difficulty is that proper structural change in the economy needs to take place and needs to take place very quickly. And fundamentally, we've got to be a business-enabling society so that there's job creation, so that there's consumption, so that basically the economy actually moves ahead. So I think having gone through a very unfriendly, business-unfriendly sort of period over the last 10 years or so, we need to move towards a more business-friendly and more win-win sort of environment. Why do I say that? Well, the private sector makes up more than 2/3 of the economy. It's got the capital, it's got the skills. It can deliver. We've seen it time and time again, and it can deliver on budget and on time. And we've seen that the state-owned enterprises over this whole period have basically, I think, have been undevelopmental institutions. They're not developmental institutions in the sense that they're not creating value, they're actually destructing value and make it more difficult for the private sector to actually operate. So I think the model that we've seen with renewable energy should be expanded. You'd know me a lot better than myself, but I think one area could be the transport sector, logistics, other services, in the ports, for example, I think could be much more adequately handled by the private sector than the public sector if it's done more on a competitive sort of basis. And I think, as I said, we've got a great model which is on the table already. And then I think we could experiment more with export processing zones, whether they're called industrial development zones or whatever, to find out what's actually impeding investment. So you could actually tweak policy. Is it the wage rate? Is it the tax rate? Is it high input costs? Fiddle with those levers in areas that are basically export orientated and do not compete with existing businesses in the economy. And when you come up with the right formula, it could actually be rolled out into the rest of the economy to great effect without making big mistakes. And that's the big advice that you get from people like the Harvard group that came to advise Treasury a few years ago. You know, experiment small and then basically roll it out when you see what actually works. And then very importantly, I think we need to avoid new mistakes. So land reform is on the table at the moment. Clearly there's a lot of emotional debate and one actually understands. But we've got to also understand that if you go ahead with expropriation without compensation in a way that actually basically sends up red flags for investors, not only internationally but also locally, it's a very dangerous path because you basically could actually create an environment where people are worried about property rights more generally. So it has to be done very carefully. I think we're moving in the right direction. If you look at the ANC's conference a weekend or so ago, it seems as though there's not a need to actually change the constitution. Existing legislation could actually be changed, and where possible and where it makes sense, and in particular where state-owned enterprises and state institutions are actually sitting on land which is not being used, that could actually be parceled out almost immediately. That would be more peri-urban sort of land as well. And then we've got a number of other issues on the table in front of us: procurement legislation, mining charter, national health insurance, social security reform, all sorts of things. Hopefully not the return of nuclear, but I've just kind of like put it down there. We don't want to make those sort of mistakes. That would have been a 1 trillion rand mistake, which would have been very much embarrassing. But there is the potential that you actually move in the wrong direction on some of these issues and create a much more unversatile economy, one that actually is unable to react to the competitive forces internationally. So we definitely need to avoid that. And then lastly, I think we do need a bit of luck. So what sort of luck? Well, climate is one of those. I mean, very clearly, Western Cape, we've actually seen the devastating effects of what can actually happen with 2 or 3 years of lack of rain. I think Gauteng is by no means immune from that happening. I think that it's a disaster waiting to happen. So we do need some luck on the climate side, and in the meantime, proper planning to avoid those sort of issues. And then very importantly, the global environment is important for South Africa. We are a small, open economy. If the rest of the world's doing well, and if we've got a risk-on investment environment, then typically South Africa does very well as well. So the two things there would be, are we going to get the capital that we need to grow? Because we typically consume more than we actually create. So that's why risk and environment is very, very important, where people are actually happy to actually send capital into South Africa. And then the other issue would be, are we seeing strong global growth, and are we seeing strong improvement in commodity prices? So just to give you a bit of a snapshot of what's happening internationally at the moment, the table behind me shows you world economic growth. Top line there is global growth, and you can see there the International Monetary Fund, big multinational body, is projecting growth of just under 4%, which is not bad. It's not as strong as we saw in the first half of the 2000s, but nevertheless, it's not bad growth, and it's much, much higher than what we've seen over the last few years, where, 2.9s and up to around about, as you can see, 2016, 3.2. Those were sort of like quite weak growth years. So on the face of it, looks very positive. The developed world seems to be coming out of its funk from the global financial crisis. The US in particular is growing strongly. It's also had a number of stimulative measures like the tax reform package that Donald Trump has put in place. Lots of dangers as well, protectionist dangers, all sorts of issues, but nevertheless, for the next couple of years, the environment looks relatively secure. In the developing world, China is always the big issue because it's the world's second biggest economy, and growth seems to be moderating to about 6.5% or so, which is not bad. It's coming off a massive base. Again, lots of issues around massive explosion in debt, property prices going through the roof. A normal economy, you'd be throwing up red flags, but given the way the economy is actually administered, it looks as though they're managing their way through that and also sucking in a lot in the way of imports from other emerging economies. If you look at further down the list, you've got sub-Saharan Africa, which has come through a very bad patch, mainly because South Africa's done badly, but also the big oil producers of Angola and Nigeria and the slightly smaller Mozambique took very, very big hits during the course of 2015, 2016. They're also starting to actually emerge from that, but with some damage. And then East Africa has generally been quite a strong performer. Latin America have gone through a terrible time, mainly because their significant economy, Brazil, went through a 3-year recession as a result of very bad policy choices. Again, emerging somewhat, but with some risks. So the general picture with the sort of economies that we export to are tending to do quite a lot better. World trade has improved after a number of years of actually sub-performance. So you can actually see this is one measure of world trade, but you can see the pickup coming through during 2017, 2018. This is imports plus exports on an index basis, and the acceleration in the grey line there. So that's very positive for your industry, obviously. Even if you look at something like the Baltic Dry Shipping Index, again, it's some indicator of demand in the shipping industry, the container industry. You can actually see the big low point in 2016, which was even worse than during the financial crisis, and now the pickup coming through into 2018, although it's a very volatile sort of index, but nevertheless, it's considerable improvement from the lows that we saw a couple of years back. The so-called risk-on environment, well, it's a little bit bitty at the moment, but again, you can see this green line, which is the ratio of these two share indice lines, as I described earlier on, generally going up rather than down, and hopefully that continues. Very important for the rand as well as capital flows to South Africa. Commodity prices against that background have also performed relatively well. Slightly unfortunately, the oil prices performed better than some of the other commodity prices, and obviously that has put some stress on the inflation rate. But nevertheless, again, commodity prices bottoming in 2016 and generally actually improving, which is a good sign for us. The big danger, though, is that we're going into an environment where the US Central Bank, the US Federal Reserve, is now starting to tighten monetary policy. And you can see this extraordinary period where interest rates were basically kept at just slightly above zero. We're now starting to actually see interest rates mount in the US. And the green line that you see there, or hopefully can see there, that's real interest rates. So inflation, or rather the interest rate minus inflation, it's been through more than a decade of negative real interest rates, but now we kind of like starting to actually see a match there. In other words, we're going into a period now that's almost like uncharted territory for the last 10 years. Positive real interest rates, and what might that actually mean? Will capital move back towards the US and out of emerging markets? What sort of unintended consequences will we see coming out of this? And that's causing some of the jitters in markets over the last little while. And that's a key question for us in 2018. The other issue, of course, is what happens to the dollar. And what I've just shown in this graph behind you is the relationship between commodity prices and the US dollar. If the US dollar is weakening, as it has during the course of 2017 and into the early part of 2018, then generally you see commodity prices lifting. But if it's actually strengthening, and over the last couple of weeks, we've started to see it strengthening quite significantly on the left-hand axis, then that tends to pull commodity prices down. So this big period here, as you can see, of massive improvement in commodity prices was associated with a weak dollar, and the concern is that that might also unravel, which would not be a good thing for us. So there are a lot of questions there. My basic feel, though, is that the international environment will remain relatively favorable and very supportive for South African and African economic growth. So hopefully that will be a bit of a thumbs up for the year ahead. Just a few numbers, which I'll leave with you anyway, but as you can see, economic growth here, we're saying about 1.8% this year, 1.9%, and then starting to accelerate as some of that structural reform and some of the impact of policies already put in place start to have impact, and as confidence seeps in post the election, because I think that's another element which your next speaker, I'm sure, will deal with in more detail. But there might be some hiatus ahead of that before you start to see real improvement coming through on the confidence side, the business confidence side. The Rand, as you can see, our projections are relatively stable, some weakening trend, but not too negative. Those are average rates. And if that is the case, then inflation should remain relatively benign and interest rates relatively benign over the next couple of years. Right, that's more or less what I had prepared for you, and you all look very stunned. I'm just worried I'm at the wrong conference here. But I look at my host, maybe I can take one or two questions. I know you are a bit short of time, but yes, okay, I can take one or two questions if there are any. They're definitely stunned. Huh?
Stunned. No questions from the floor. Definitely stunned.
Okay, that either means that what I said was not understood at all, or it's so clear that you don't need to ask. Oh, that's great. Oh, there is a question here. Now, oil price, we've got basically tending up. We've got some correction coming through from the current sort of levels, and then tending slightly higher, but not getting back above 100. So around about 85, 87, that's what the assumption is in the inflation forecast. But it's a difficult one because obviously you've got new demand coming on as the price lifts, and it's that interplay between the new supply, in particular US shale, coming on, and also people starting to actually say, oh, higher prices, maybe we can actually cheat a little bit more on the quotas. So there is some evidence of additional supply coming into the market now. But the fundamentals for most commodities, I think, is one where we had massive oversupply of capacity and then a period of actually whittling away of that capacity. And that's what's helping some of the lift at the moment.
Any further questions from the floor?
I can see they've got golf rounds up. Busy checking their watches.
So we have a gift small gift for you, Dennis. Thanks very much for presenting from us. I think from the floor. Oh, can we? Yeah. Okay. Just put together. Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I think we could have had some more good news. Thank you. Okay. Great. Yeah, I think we were looking for some more good news, but there are positives out there. Just everything needs to go right and no mistakes. Okay. But thanks very much, Dennis, for a very good outlook for us. Our next speaker is Ralph Mateka. Okay, and Ralph has written. Is an author and has written the book When Zuma Goes, okay, which is obviously very pertinent for the time that we're right in. So I think we're looking forward to understand, what's going to happen to us in the economy, and Zuma has gone. So can we please have Ralph come and tell us what to expect in the very near future? Thanks very much, Ralph.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, just pull this down to yourself.
Okay. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, Mr. Zuma is gone. I knew he was going to go at some point. No doubt about that. Let me just start by quickly reflecting on the first panel, the discussion that took place here with Mike and colleagues around the 30 centimeter difference. I didn't know that size is such a big difference in this industry. The regulatory environment, it reminds me, as the discussion was underway, I thought of a very interesting Greek mythology. Some of you might be aware of. There is this mythology called, in the Greek mythology, there is this character called Procrustes. I don't know if you know him. When people always say that you procrastinate and so forth, that's from the character there called Procrustes. So the story goes that Procrustes was living in a place where he will kidnap visitors who were passing by, and he had this bed that he had manufactured. A bed had shackles and all sorts of stuff. So apparently he will kidnap, invite unsuspecting visitors at night. They will pass through, then he will take them, put them in that bed. And apparently if your legs were too strong, too long for that bed, he will cut them so that you can fit in bed. And if your legs were very short, he will stretch until your bones break so that you can fit in bed. Why I'm saying this? This is how I characterize the relationship between the road freight agency now and government when it comes to how you regulate these containers, that you have to go and get a torch and cut the container so that it can fit. Somebody's getting their legs being broken and being stretched and being cut. And I think that is the type of policy and regulatory environment that I actually want to speak about in my presentation. I don't know much about trucking except for a few horror movies that I've seen where you have truckers flashing the lights and so forth. But a good movie that I've also seen, and I think that picture might have been taken from one of the movies. I mean, if you look at that picture there with the voice, it looks to me it's like watching a trucker through the barrel of a gun, if you look at it, the grooves inside and so forth. But a good picture as well that I remember about trucking is this good movie that I've seen where a trucker is flashing the light behind a family. The families, they are scared. What is going to happen? He's going to run us over. And then finally, they stop and the trucker returns a teddy bear to the family that, no, I found it in the previous hotel where you were in, putting truckers in a good light. So that's how far I know about trucking as an industry. But one thing I can state for sure is that I do understand the regulatory and policy environment against which your industry operate, and that is what I'm going to try to outline now. To start with, I decided to just break my conversation into a few things. Saving the ANC from itself. I mean, Dennis spoke about the good news. I have no sense of good or bad news. For me, it's just news. So I'm going to present from that point of view. You will decide whether it's good or it's bad. But as far as I'm concerned, it's politics. I'm going to look at Mr. Ramaphosa's project, saving the ANC from itself, managing internal resistance from within the ANC, implications for the 2019 elections, but also most importantly as well, which I think is very much important, and it has got implications for where you work. It's the position of opposition parties in South Africa. I believe that we have a serious problem of a very radicalized opposition politics in South Africa. We have a very radicalized policy space, which I think someone has to do some work in rebuilding center politics. And I think until you build that center politics, until you legitimize bargaining at the center, we are going to have a very volatile policy environment. I will explain how this connects to the safety of the trucks on the road, why your industry and your sector has become so vulnerable to protest on the road, and why it is likely to continue in the medium term, and possibly if the center is being reconstituted, maybe you can start to see positive development as some see it, or maybe, let's say, lessening of tensions at the policy space. Saving the ANC from itself. This is quite, I mean, the past few days we have responded to the question of 100 days in office. How did Mr. Ramaphosa perform since President Jacob Zuma is gone? And one of the questions that I dealt with personally, people ask me, is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? And being a realist, I said to people that at least the glass has been recovered. You know, you no longer have the difficulty of finding where the glass is. And I thought that was quite, for those who see it in terms of positive and negative, you know where the glass is. You are not trying to locate the glass, because I think the past 7 or so years, we've been trying to locate where the glass is in the first place. We couldn't even respond as to whether it was half full or half empty. But there are some realities as well. How do you disentangle the question of state capture? How do you come up with investigation into state capture and make sure that it works, and at the same time try to win elections in 2019 as Mr. Ramaphosa? It's quite difficult. And again, implications for the survival of those who are implicated in the state capture as well. There are people with political lives, and I think as part of any transition, some people need to survive and they're going to fight back. And there is a fight back strategy within the ANC when it comes to investigations on state capture and grand corruption. It will be naive not to think that there will be a fight back strategy. And also managing societal expectations and internal limitations. That is what the difficulty I think Mr. Ramaphosa's leadership is confronted with. You have this nation that has endured the crisis of maybe corruption for the last 7 years. And then you have the president coming in. Within the first 5 months, people want to see people in jail. I always say that is unrealistic. It is only possible if you are in a dictatorship. In a dictatorship, you don't have to follow due process. You can just round up the usual suspect and jail them. But we are a democracy, and you are going to have to follow due process. That is why it might be taking time, and people might feel very disappointed about what is happening, not seeing people going to jail and so forth. A very good economist, I will not mention, made a very good suggestion, and he might be in this room, so that actually the best way is to just make sure Nkandla becomes a good jail itself. I don't want to mention this gentleman. In any way, I think that the biggest problem that we are having now as the transition is happening, and again, from the point of view of good or bad news, I have to state that we have a president with a sense of what is good and what is bad, a sense of what is wrong and what is right. But it might take time to actually get that to materialize. But at least I would say from where we come from, we have that moral position that is setting in where, as a nation, we now know a sense of good and bad, and the leadership, I think, is reflecting that. But again, the issue here within the ANC is how do you manage internal resistance within the ANC? I mean, you know what has happened in Nasrec. Those of you who looked at the result of the elective conference of the ANC, they will agree that the president won through a very narrow margin, Nasrec. Actually, I would say that the deputy president of the ANC, Mr. David Mabuza, has got a much stronger margin than the president of the ANC, Mr. Ramaphosa. Mr. Ramaphosa won by about 140-something margin, whereas Mr. Mabuza won by, I think, in the range of 340 or so. If you were to gauge the mandate that these individuals carry within the ANC, you will actually have to arrive at the conclusion that Mr. Mabuza seems to have a much more solid power base within the ANC than Mr. Ramaphosa. And that itself tells us about the extent to which Mr. Ramaphosa can actually experiment when it comes to coming up with structural changes within our society. And I think that where we are now, you have the former president who is standing trial for corruption in KwaZulu-Natal, which makes provinces much more of contested areas. And I think one thing that Mr. Zuma has done very well in the last few years of his administration was actually to inaugurate an anti-corruption, to inaugurate political survival project into an some form of mobilization against anti-corruption. That is the reason why when we look at what is happening, when you look at Mr. Ramaphosa's move so far, people have been asking, is he the one getting people to work at the Hawks? Is he the one trying to inspire that confidence to make sure that people actually raid the Northwest province and the Free State province and so forth? And my answer has been quite simple, that he cannot be seen doing that. And he doesn't have to do that in order for the Hawks to actually start doing some of their work. I'm of the view that the bar was so low in South Africa that actually some members of the police just didn't show up. And at least one thing for sure is that now they've realized that they can actually show up and there will be no president actually blocking them from doing their job. That does not necessarily mean you have the president who is picking the phone and trying to get people to do their job. I think that within the law enforcement, people are actually reading the political wind and being aware that they can do certain things. It's just that something that maybe is good for us as a nation. This time the wind is blowing in the right direction, where people can actually do some of the basic investigations. Although you do have within the ANC a very solid, I would say, narrative that says that any aggressive measure to go against people who are implicated in corruption, it is actually purging of the people who did not support Mr. Ramaphosa in Nasrec. This is the reason why it took such a long time to get rid of Northwest Premier. This is the reason why I think that some of the major changes in the law enforcement, some of the major changes when it comes to investigation are going to come by way of negotiations. I'm of the view that Mr. Ramaphosa is going to have to negotiate his way through, particularly across different provinces. Provinces such as KwaZulu-Natal, provinces such as Northwest, we have seen negotiations. As we speak, we are not sure as to Mr. Mahumapelu's position within the party in Northwest, because that is also very much important to make sure that if you are having realignment at government level, but you are also having it at party level, where those who might be aligned with Mr. Mahumapelu are not going to use their power hold within the province to frustrate Ramaphosa's new dawn, if you like. And for me, one thing that I think has come out from the internal battles within the ANC, that has come out from Northwest, and there is nothing that has come out from Nasrec, I beg your pardon. And there is nothing that we can do about it on a medium term. We just have to watch it unfold. It is the emergence of provinces as actually a place for the power barons within the ANC. Look at what is happening in KwaZulu-Natal province. It is not an easy province to realign. President Jacob Zuma is there, but you have a very strong factions within KZN that is trying to hold on to resist some kind of a change that can be initiated by the national leadership of the ANC. The province of Eastern Cape is also being mentioned as of concern. Northern Cape as well, it is being mentioned as of concern. What that means is that if you look at the power hold that Mr. Ramaphosa has, very strong at national level, but quite weak at provincial level, and you have much more intensified lobbying, intensified continuation of some of the remnants of the factions that have existed within the party, continuing at provincial level. And if you look at South Africa's election, you'll realize that there is no way that the national leadership of the ANC can just march into a province and try to rein in the provinces. For two reasons. First, I don't think the national leadership of the ANC is quite unanimous as to what to do with the provinces. You've got the top six that some keep on sending mixed messages as to what you need to do about the provinces. But equally is that there has been a shift from the ANC where provinces have become very strategic as a power base to actually influence the national leadership of the party. We don't know how the provincial realignment is going to take place in Mpumalanga since Mr. Mabuza moved from Mpumalanga and now he's at national leadership. Expectations are that maybe he will get his allies who will be able to support him at national level in a manner that it will not cause problem for Mr. Ramaphosa. But the reality is that going into these elections, the biggest concern that I think the ANC is going to have is actually the provincial powers. How do you rein in the provincial leadership of the party? And what are the implications thereof for the 2019? The last thing you want as the national leadership of the ANC is to go into 2019 election with KZN province not fully behind the national leadership, not fully behind Mr. Ramaphosa. Northwest province has also become quite risky because in the past years, Northwest has always been well aligned with the national leadership. It has not been a problem for the ANC. And now you have to manage Mr. Mahuma Pelu's exit at provincial level very carefully so that you do not create an environment for mutiny thereof. The Eastern Cape province as well, you just can't move on with this anti-corruption mantra in Eastern Cape without being worried about upsetting people. And further, you look at the province of Limpopo as well, which I haven't mentioned here. Quite often you hear that Limpopo is quite stable. No, I don't think so. If you look at Limpopo, there is quite intense power battle in Limpopo. We know that they're supposed to having their provincial conference I think they're having it in a couple of weeks or so. And the problem is that the current premier of Northwest, of Limpopo, is being accused of sitting on a report that could implicate some of provincial power holders or provincial power barons, if you like. So the question is, how far can you really go when it comes to anti-corruption? And what are the realistic expectations from Mr. Ramaphosa when it comes to anti-corruption? My view is that he's got to tread very carefully. You can't go to a point where you are risking losing 2019 elections because, first and foremost, Mr. Ramaphosa does not have a full mandate from the nation. The mandate that he has might be still from within the ANC, coming from the Nasrec conference, but he still needs to get a mandate from the 2019 election. The problem is, you need provinces to be quite coherent when you go into that elections. I've seen reports months ago that the ANC want early elections, and my response was that, well, bring it on. I don't think the party is in a position to go into early elections now. They still need to get it right at provincial level. Unless otherwise, we are going to have a split vote for the first time where provinces are now voting locally, regionally, in terms of the power balance, while nationally they are using their power balance there to kind of issue a referendum on Mr. Ramaphosa's leadership. But then, are we done with the question of leadership within the ANC? Can we be secure that after the 2019 elections, we are going to forget about the leadership tussle, and then the new leadership that has been elected in Nasrec can then focus on structural reforms, can then focus on policy, can then focus on making sure that they get the economy back on track? I don't think so. There is something that just keeps creeping within the ANC. There is just this thing that keeps on saying that if people are unhappy, they will convene a special NGC so that they can deal with some of the wounds of Nasrec. So what that says is that you do have the president who constantly have to look behind the shoulders to make sure that there are no people who are actually trying to mobilize against him. The ANC is unfortunately on a permanent internal succession mode, and that itself create a sense of paralysis within the party, because if the party is so drawn into this constant permanent leadership mode, it means that when the president thinks about policies, the big consideration has to be, how does that secure my second term? Is there a guarantee? I mean, immediately when you get the first term, you should be given an opportunity to try to consolidate. You should be given an opportunity to put your agenda. But within the ANC, you're getting to this point where just when you get the first term, people are already thinking about the second term, whether you're going to get the second term. That places the party on this permanent election internal succession mode. I will come back to the question of the land issue, the extent to which it poses paralysis within the ANC. But then, I can't forget about the opposition. Most of the times when we talk about radicalized political space, when we talk about populism, we only focus on the ANC, we only focus on the EFF. But I think that we are forgetting that actually South Africa's opposition is becoming more and more radicalized and much more actually populist. I will show a figure as to what this means. Look at the opposition in South Africa. I believe that since Mr. Ramaphosa became the president of the ANC, since his 100th year in office, the opposition in South Africa is falling apart. Before, under President Jacob Zuma's administration, you would see the EFF, you would see the DA, you would see COPE, you would see the UDM actually sharing a stage took a position against Mr. Zuma's administration. But we are no longer seeing that. They're taking a stage against each other. I believe that what we are seeing now is an opposition within the opposition. There is a contest for the opposition space within South Africa's politics. The net effect is the general decline of opposition politics, incoherence, inconsistencies, and grandstanding. That is why there is a concern within the DA that you might have seen reports this morning over the weekend that there is a possibility of a split. Of course, I doubt if that is going to happen, but I believe that there are deep-seated sentiments within the DA where people are actually concerned about the direction that the party is taking. It is because of some are suspecting that the party is becoming more populist, the DA is moving a little bit to the left, the DA seems to be quoting ideas around affirmative action and so forth, and that is unsettling some people within the DA. And the ANC, is it possible that the ANC can retain hegemony in South African politics? This is the structure that I actually have been developing over a period of time, and it is actually the last part of the presentation. So this is how I think about South African politics. Think about this as the center. The center is where you get common sense. It's where, before the 2014 elections in South Africa, the center was defined by the ANC and the DA. You have had the ANC and the DA orbiting much closer to the center here. Before 2014 elections, I can say it with greater sense of certainty that there were more agreements between the ANC and the DA. Actually, you could say there was some form of coalescence. Remember that time when Lindiwe Masibuko was still the leader of the DA caucus in Parliament, and she actually voted in Parliament to support a legislation that you could say was very closer to affirmative action. It caused problems within the DA leadership, but there were no deeper agreement between the DA and the ANC. For the first time, actually, in 1994, when the ANC-led government came up with the National Development Plan, the DA was the first party to actually congratulate the ANC, using terms such as consensus. This is the first policy position that actually shows consensus in South African politics. The differences between the DA and the ANC in that time, for me, it was just rhetoric. But then came the 2014 general elections. We all know what happened in the 2014 general elections. You had a new planet, I call it a new planet, that began to orbit far from the center. It moves here. Can anyone take a guess as to what is this new planet? It is the EFF. The EFF's entry into South African politics actually destabilized any relationship between the DA and the ANC. It actually destabilized the center. My view is that the EFF moves here. It actually said to everyone that what is happening here, the negotiations that might be happening here, all the concessions that are being made, civilized politics, civilized way of engagement. Remember what was happening here? When the DA did not agree with the ANC, what did they do? The DA decided to go to court. They did not disrupt each other. Before 2014 elections, we did not see open disruptions in Parliament as a method of engagement. That is what we did not see. But then when the EFF started coming, what happened? These two parties started shifting away from the center. If you look at the ANC today, if you listen to the ANC speaking about the question of land, if you listen to the ANC speaking about policy, you might think you're talking about a party that has got 5% of the votes. Doesn't sound like a party that has got 62% of the vote, the party that has got authority, the party that has got legitimacy, the party that is sitting on a very strong mandate to preside upon society and actually even define some of the narratives as to how policy is being dealt with. You have here the ANC that is talking about the questions of white monopoly capital. You've got the ANC that's actually saying that they need to change the constitution to bring about their own policies because their policies have been hampered by the constitution. You have the ANC here that is actually no longer willing to stay at the center and negotiate for policies at the center. You've got the ANC that is responding to the pulling forces of this. This is very strange in South African politics because you don't often find political arrangement where a party that is sitting on 62% of the votes is responding to a party that has 6.4% of the votes. What have we seen in Parliament when it comes to expropriation of land? I thought it was embarrassing actually when I saw the debate, the motion how the motion was being debated in Parliament. I mean, I've heard some of the senior members of ANC actually saying, 2 more minutes, actually saying that, referring to Julius Malema with a great deal of respect. I mean, Commander-in-Chief, as you have with this motion that you have placed before us, we think we will work for our people. And I was like, who is setting the narrative in South Africa's policy discourse here? Is it the EFF or is it the ANC? And I have to say that as we speak, the narrative in South Africa's political discourse is not being set by the ANC. It is set by the EFF. The ANC is responding to the EFF, which is quite strange because in most cases, you will want to see it opposite. But then, even what is worse about this arrangement, it is the DA itself, ladies and gentlemen. Since 2014, you can go do the mathematics. The DA has staged so many street marches on the street. Why? Because they want to be seen as relevant. They want to be seen as capable of marching out there. Of course, when they march, they don't bend down everything. That is why their marches maybe don't get this coverage and so forth. But we have seen the DA moving more towards more populism than we have seen before. And my concern is that the DA is also abandoning center politics. That is why if you listen to the language, you listen to the manner in which DA members are engaging each other, it's no longer about concessions. It's no longer about compromises at the center. It's about we want to be seen taking a hard line. Take, for example, the DA's position against VAT increase. I mean, this is the party that is against corporate tax increase. And now they're against VAT increase. It doesn't make sense whatsoever in line with their policy position because my view about VAT increase is that at least we are spreading the cost of reinstating the fiscus to everyone else. You are not targeting corporations. You are not targeting a special group and saying that we need to go for corporate tax. But the DA took a position to oppose VAT increase. Why? Because they are desperately shopping for anything to oppose so that they can stay relevant in the changing ecosystem of South Africa's politics. But even what worries me is that the wage demands, where you work, the wage demands in South Africa are no longer negotiated from the center. They are negotiated here, on the outside of the center, and they're being influenced also by this small planet, which is the EFF as well. The land issue, if you look at the debate on the land issue, the nuances that are failing to come out on the land issue, it's also politics of here, politics of the outliers. It's not a center politics by any chance. You look at the race dialogue as well within the Democratic Alliance, it's also not being approached with the language of the center. It's not about concessions. It is also being dealt with here. And who else is here when it comes to a radicalized, populist political space? Here, this is Freedom Front Plus as well, ladies and gentlemen, also on the outlier. Most of South Africa's political parties are no longer comfortable in building here. This is the new Trade Union Federation as well. It is also not working here. It is working on this side because we are in a situation where the general feeling is that center politics does not work. My view, maybe it's good news, is that Mr. Ramaphosa actually, as much as he tries by all means to pay lip service to this radical politics that is happening here, he's the best representative you have about center politics. He's the only person who I think, if you look at when it comes to the leadership, the only person who I think has got a potential to actually rebuild this center. But it's going to be a very difficult task because if he's being seen as too much centrist, there will be a cost to 2019 for him. If he performs too badly in 2019, the ANC will recall him because there are those who are just looking for any reason to recall him. If he performs too well in 2019, the ANC will go back to that majoritarian politics again where they don't see any need to get to consensus. So what is the best option? A good mediocre pass. Just like I rated him last week, I said that give him 59% so far. Don't give him 60. Give him 55% there because if he gets 55%, if he wins the election, takes the NC through to 55%. In that way, the NC knows that it is out of ICU, but not strong enough to play rugby. And if he wins by a strong majority of over 60%, the party is going to run around, and actually they won't even need Mr. Ramaphosa to reinstate and rebuild their relationship with the broader society. Here, another scary thing. We have had reports coming out about the collapse of local government. The audit report are actually an indication that local government is actually collapsing. And a collapsed local government just means more protest. Physically, more protest means your trucks are going to be stopped because they are the most easy target on the road. As you know, throughout development, the best towns are usually the one next to the road or even a railway. That is where development corridors take place. So when you say that if the truck stops, South Africa stops, people who are protesting have actually realized that the best way to stop South Africa is to stop the trucks, which has become a strategic area of focus when it comes to protesting. And you're going to see more of that because the ANC, unless otherwise, they go back to the center and delegitimize any disruptive politics and come back and recapture and regain control of the land debate and make sure that they actually acknowledge their own achievement that have happened at the center. Because a great deal of achievement, I think, has been achieved at the center. I just get surprised when the party wants to distance itself from its achievement that they've achieved through staying at the center. So if we do not solve this, if we do not move away from this disruptive politics, we're going to see this going on and on and on. And my last word is, what is it that you're doing at the freight agency? I know very little about you, but I read newspapers every day. I don't know whether you believe that you will gain respect just because you are doing a good thing. I don't think you are saying much about the good thing that you're doing. I hear you saying that you are the hub of South Africa's economy, but are you really going out there and saying that? I will put it very clear. If I was in government and a serious agency was having a meeting such as this, I'll make sure that my deputy minister or my minister go there, because that actually also tells about the importance of this. Why is it that some of the conversation you can have, this tough conversation about the sector, about the industry, and there are other important factors out there that might keep some of the political leadership away. I'm saying all this because in my experience in South African politics, in my experience in understanding what is happening in the policy environment, most of the industry tend to think that because they're doing a good thing, that's just enough. Good is not good enough. You also need to put pressure to the policymakers so that they can take you seriously. Quite often, I interact with people who work on this thing in Washington and so forth. If you go to the USA, you ask people in the sector about what is happening in Congress, they will give you the whole timetable about issues, about what committee meetings for the whole year. But maybe give me this sense of comfort. If I ask any of the officials within your association, do you have a full timetable of what is happening within the transport portfolio for the next 4 months? Do you have that? And if you do not have that, how are you expecting to be taken seriously by policymakers if you are not making your presence being felt at that level? I don't think people should feel ashamed to represent their own interest with the lawmakers. And also, I don't think people should feel ashamed for actually stating what they stand for in the public arena. I mean, I read about trucks being banned, I read about that, but I lack a sense of perspective as to how this actually connects with the economy. Of course, you're doing a great job, no doubt about it, but my advice is that you need to do more to be taken seriously. You need to be more aggressive about your own interests, because I believe you are present in the economy compared to you are present in the public space and how you have been taken seriously by the lawmakers. It is very disproportionate. You are here in terms of the economy. I want that plasma to be delivered. But you are present in South Africa's space, your relationship and your presence, your aggressiveness in dealing with the lawmakers is actually at the lower level. And I think that it has to be upped. There should not be any shame in lobbying in this sector. And I think you should take that and take it further. And once you are done lobbying, there is a new book coming in, which is I just finished this. My publishers just couldn't let me rest. My book is being printed. I'm looking at Mr. Ramaphosa's 10. It's not a 10 to it. I do believe that indeed we are on a positive trajectory, but But as Dennis said, there could be mistakes. We are a nation that is prone to own goals, and we need to avoid some of those own goals. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Wait, we've got you have a... Okay, let me check you out. Thanks very much, Bob. That's great. That's perfect. Ralph, if you could stay with us for a few questions. If Ralph could just take a few questions. So, do we have questions from the floor for Ralph? There's a question over there. I could have a...
Ralph, thanks. Great speech. What sort of alliances are you going to see in politics in the next 2 years going up to elections? So there's rumors of Ramaphosa with Malema, etc. What do you see?
I really think that the EFF is becoming very suspicious of Ramaphosa's intention. I listened to Floyd Shivambu very well a few weeks ago in Parliament, because I believe that when the ANC joined with the EFF in Parliament on that motion, I do think that the aim was also to try to manage the EFF, get them closer rather than far away. But the EFF is made of a bunch of very clever people. They went to vets, some I studied with them, and they're already becoming suspicious. I mean, Floyd was saying that Mr. Ramaphosa, the ANC is trying to tone down on this land issue to avoid the constitutional amendment. And actually, Floyd was saying that members of ANC, the likes of Ino Godongwane, were going out throwing mixed messages, showing the declining commitment of the ANC about this. That itself means that the possibility of a long-term alliance between the ANC and the EFF is actually dissipating. I don't think there is such a chance. I think that even if Mr. Malema himself gets flattered every time people are saying the ANC wants him back, Mama Winnie wants him back, everybody likes to be flattered once in a while, I think that the EFF's political project has matured to a point where there are those within the party whom I believe cannot stand being part of the ANC. I think that there are those who have carved their way out in a way that they will not be able to get into alliance with the ANC. The only concern I have, though, is that the more the ANC keeps on conceding to the EFF, or the more they keep on conceding to some of the way of solving problems that is outside the formal process, the party gets very weak as a source of legitimacy in decisions at the center. That is where the problem is. And I think that is what we are seeing around the question of land. I think that there is a deep thinking within the party, the ANC, about that. I do think that if the ANC performs moderately, the best is the elections. If the ANC gets 55%, it might become more and more reasonable. But if it gets 62%, that's where the problem, I think, will be. Thank you.
I think we can take one more question, if there's another question from the floor. There's a question over here. Yeah.
Mine is not a question. Okay. Mine is not a question, but I would like to support what Mr. Matea said in his closing statement, that we are doing a wonderful job in South Africa, but our relationship with government as the lawmakers, that's what we need to get right. I attended the budget speech in Parliament last week. Nothing was said about us. So you can clearly see that the relationship that we have with the lawmakers is not so solid. But let us not despair, because government is there for us. Unfortunately, the ministers keep on changing. We don't have a minister who has been in that position for over 10 years. They serve for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, which is not enough to get to understand our industry. So let us not lose hope. Let us engage with them. The doors are open for us to engage with them. That's what I want to emphasize.
Thank you. So, just Ralph, before you go, we wanted to at least let some people read Ralph's book. So, there are 2 seats in this audience have a little ticket under the seat. So we're going to ask you now all to get up and have a look under your seats and see if there may be a ticket there.
I like that. That's good. I would not have thought. It's a good strategy.
Aha. We've got one over there. If you could come up and get your book. If you'd give that out to, that would be great.
That's a great pleasure. I've signed them.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, that ticket. Okay. Has anyone else found the other ticket? Ah, there's one. Okay. Okay, and if you'd also just
thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And the glass is half full now.
Yes. Well, at least we can see it.
Thank
Great.
Thank you so much.
A little more to you, but there's another book we're going to... is that right?
We're going to have to send a book to someone else. We'll have to send a book.
So this helps because I don't like reading anyway.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
That's great. Well, thank you, Ralph. Yeah, and his message that we need to develop a better contact with government, and maybe government not taking us as seriously as they should. I think I don't know. When we look at it, we think that government doesn't take their own Department of Transport that seriously, in that they change ministers in such a rapid rate that we almost have no opportunity to actually develop a relationship with those ministers, because as soon as we develop them, they're gone. So yeah, we understand, and we continue to try very hard to keep that relationship going with government.